Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another meeting of the PCAOB's Standing Advisory Group. I'd like to welcome all the SAG members who are here and SAG observers, and also welcome those who are viewing the SAG meeting via our webcast. Most of you know me, but for those on the webcast, I'm Marty Baumann, the PCAOB's Chief Auditor and Director of Professional Standards. I say this probably every meeting, but it's important that I say it again. The Standing Advisory Group is an incredibly valuable resource for the PCAOB, and we're truly grateful for the time you invest in these meetings and for the valuable advice and insights that you share with us at these meetings and at other times throughout the year. So thank you for your willingness to be members of the Standing Advisory Group. As always, as you know, we welcome and strongly encourage SAG member comments and questions throughout the meeting. As a reminder, just place your 10 card on its edge when you want to make a comment, and we'll call on you. We generally call on cards based upon the order in which they went up. However, we like to keep the flow of a dialogue going well, so if your point is particularly pertinent to the last point that someone just made, make some other sort of signal, and we'll try to make sure that we call on you as well to make sure that the dialogue continues. We previously distributed by the way, first of all, I wanted to mention some new members. The SAG members haven't changed. Everybody's the same SAG members, but the last meeting, Sarah Lewis was unable to be here. Sarah is the CEO of Lewis Corporate Advisors and a member of a number of audit committees. Sarah, hello, welcome. Also with us today for the first time is Mike Sante. Mike is sitting down at the end towards my left. Mike is the incoming chair of the Auditing Standards Board. The Auditing Standards Board has a seat as an observer at all of our meetings, so welcome to Mike. And also Arnold Schilder, the chair of the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, was unable to make the meeting, and so board member Megan Zeitzman, to my left, is sitting in for Arnold. So welcome to all of you. And please feel free to put your 10 cards up and participate throughout the meeting. So we've previously distributed the agenda to everyone and reading materials for the meeting, so hopefully you have a pretty good idea of the topics to be covered over the next couple of days. In your folders, you have the agenda together with the meeting materials that were previously distributed. Also included in your folders are the standard setting agenda as of September 30th, and information about all members of the SAG and official observers. This morning, Chairman Doty will provide an update on developments at the PCAOB. Although the role of the SAG is largely to assist the board in its standard-setting responsibilities, Jim's update, as usual, will cover all aspects of the board's activities. After Jim's comments, please feel free to inquire about any matters Jim discusses or other general questions about the board's activities. The remainder of the morning will be devoted to topics related to audit quality indicators. Steve Kroll and Greg Jonas will discuss the recent concept release and an overview of the comments that we received on that release. After those introductory comments, we'll move to 3 breakout sessions where we'll seek your input on various aspects of the AQI project. Your assigned rooms for the breakout sessions are in your folders, and our staff will be directing you to those rooms during the morning coffee break. The rooms are all up on the second floor. They may be marked C, D, and E, and your rooms are 1, 2, and 3 in your folders. So read 1 as C, and 2 as D, and 3 as E. But I think we're also putting maybe numbers up there now to get it, so it'll be coordinated. Tomorrow morning, back here, there will be reports back to the entire SAG of the results of the discussions in each breakout session. So each breakout session is discussing a different aspect of the AQI comments, but the entire group will come back, hear what was discussed at each breakout room, and have opportunity for further discussion and comment by all the SAG members, primarily leading to your advice to us regarding next steps for the AQI project. This afternoon session starts with an annual update from me on the standard setting agenda. SAG members should feel free during that update to share your views with us regarding our standard setting priorities and make any recommendations you deem appropriate regarding those priorities or other standards-related matters you think we should be considering. So very eager to hear your views on our standard-setting agenda and other thoughts you have on matters that maybe should be covered as well. The remainder of the afternoon will be devoted to emerging issues that could affect audits, auditors, or the PCAOB. A 5-member panel of your fellow SAG members will lead this discussion. These SAG members identify the emerging issues and prepare the slides that are in your folders and will form the basis for these discussions. The slides in the folders are slightly modified from the slides that were sent to you, the advanced version that was sent to you, so please refer to these during the discussions. SAG members will have a brief opportunity to comment on these emerging issues during this afternoon's introductory session, as well as introducing other emerging issues that other SAG members believe are appropriate and important and that should be considered by auditors, and the PCAOB. Again, after the introductory session, we will again go to breakout sessions. And once again, your breakout sessions are in your folder. In the breakout sessions, we want to explore in depth 2 topics in each room, 2 different topics in each of the breakout rooms. But after those 2 topics, or the 2 primary topics, are explored, there should be enough time to raise other issues that are of interest to those SAG members in each room and discuss those matters as well. Tomorrow morning back here, there will be reports back from each of the breakout rooms and a further opportunity again for the full SAG group to discuss these emerging issues. We think this is a really important topic to hear from the SAG panel, first of all, and I appreciate the effort that you all put into this, about the emerging issues that could be affecting audits in the PCAOB that they've identified, and that for the rest of the SAG members to participate in that discussion, share their views on those emerging issues, as well as other issues that you think are important to auditors as they go into year-end 2015 audits, or for the PCAOB for standard-setting matters or further exploration. The intent of this agenda item is really to seek your views on what are the important issues affecting audits of the PCAOB and what auditors or the PCAOB should be doing to respond appropriately to these issues. In the final session tomorrow, the staff will present an update on an important project regarding the auditor's use of the work of specialists. As you'll recall, back in June, we discussed a staff consultation paper exploring possible standard-setting approaches for the use of the work of specialists. Tomorrow's session will discuss key comment themes we received on that consultation paper and seek your advice on the way forward with respect to certain aspects of the project. So as I mentioned earlier, please raise your 10 cards early and often to share with us your questions and comments. That input is really important to us as we advance our standard-setting priorities and address emerging issues. I do want to make this comment up here, the disclaimer, that the views expressed by each of the presenters are their own personal views and not necessarily representative of the views of the board, the PCAOB, or any other staff members. Okay, so with that, we're going to change the agenda just slightly and move Jim's discussion to right after Greg and Steve Kroll will talk about the introductory comments on audit quality indicators. Steve?
Thank you, Marty. Good morning. My name is Steve Kroll, and I'm a member of the AQI project team. The team is especially happy to have this opportunity to meet with the Standing Advisory Group because of the group's background with AQIs. It worked through the initial set of about 70 potential AQIs and really helped us shape the project. In May 2013, and considered other aspects of the project in depth at its November 2013 and June 2014 meetings. Like most things, these issues don't go away. They're still relevant today. The discussions that we've planned for today and tomorrow come at a very important time for the project. The board has issued its concept release and subsequently received the comments summarized in your materials. Interest in AQIs in various forms has continued to grow, both here and abroad. And I'd have to give a nod to the IAASB in that context. The challenge, though, is deciding what to do next. Moving the project forward involves hard questions. Some were raised in the concept release itself, and others were raised in the comments. Most go to the possibility of achieving the release's stated purpose, which was, quote, creating a potential portfolio of quantitative measures that may provide new insights about how to evaluate the quality of audits and how high-quality audits are achieved. The topics posed for the breakout groups later this morning try to focus these critical questions, and we are eager, given the group's experience, to hear its views about those questions and about the project's future direction. The next speaker is my friend George Wilford, a Deputy Director of ORA, who will talk in greater detail about the plans for the discussions. After that, Greg Jonas, whom I think all of you know, the Director of ORA and the leader of the AQI project, will give you an overview of the broad areas of agreement and controversy that we extracted from the comments. Finally, Jane Hutchins, to my left, also a team member, will review the assignments and location for the breakout groups. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we found the SAG's counsel very helpful in developing our concept release. The comment period ended in September, and the board received 47 comments, which, as Steve noted, the staff has summarized in the exhibits to your handouts for your reference during the breakout sessions. We thought it might be beneficial to briefly discuss both the format and the goals of the breakout sessions, which will help set the stage and provide context for the discussion. The format we have planned for you today consists of 3 breakout sessions addressing different aspects of the concept release. Each breakout session has been assigned a specific topic and series of questions for discussion. The goals we would like to achieve include identifying the areas of general agreement with respect to the topic and questions assigned to each group, obtaining an understanding of the areas of controversy. So in this regard, we would very much appreciate SAG members sharing their insights with us so we can help discern the underlying rationale for differing views. In addition, we always greatly value new ideas and recommendations. In tomorrow morning's debrief session, we will be presented in 2 parts. First, we will present a summary of the views from the breakout sessions. The concept release acknowledged a wide range of ways forward using AQIs to inform and promote audit quality. We would like to devote the second half of tomorrow's discussion to the topic of next steps and request each SAG member to offer a summary recommendation about how the board should move forward. Next, I'd like to turn to Greg, who would like to share the staff's observations regarding the areas of broad agreement and the issues that may be perceived as controversial in the comment letters received to date.
Great, George. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. You know, it's always dangerous to try to summarize the themes from comment letters because they're full of detail, they're full of nuance. To really understand them, you need to read all of them. So at the risk of generalizing, let me lead with my chin and summarize what the staff believes to be the central areas, starting with agreement. First of all, we perceive, not exactly unanimous, but an overwhelming majority of folks continue to believe that discussion about AQIs, the AQI project, is a useful thing to be doing, that potentially AQIs could be very useful to informing discussions about audit quality. The second area of we perceive to be strong consensus relates to an area of the concept release where we kind of led with our chin, and that was we described what we believe to be the characteristics of a useful AQI, that it's quantitative, that they operate in packs as a portfolio so we can triangulate on quality, that they require context to be understood, that is, the metric plus context equals insight, The metric alone is unlikely to yield insight. That their purpose is to inform discussion and help people ask the right question rather than answering questions themselves. And then importantly, they are not scorecards, they're not safe harbors, they're not benchmarks. That description of what we think a useful AQI is seemed to get a lot of applause in the concept letters. A third area of broad agreement is that audit committees are a key user. That doesn't mean that others may not be key users, but a strong consensus that at least the audit committee is a key user of AQIs, and that in their discussions, the most informative AQIs are likely to be at the engagement level rather than at, say, the firm level, industry level, office level, some other type of AQI. So engagement level AQIs are the focus of audit committee discussions. And then a final area of broad agreement is that if AQIs are useful at all, they're likely to be useful to the larger engagements, the more complex work, and to the larger firms. It's an open and debatable question about how useful the AQIs are to the smallest engagements in the smaller firms, the so-called scalability question. So if those are the areas of agreement, where are the areas of controversy? Well, first, a package of controversy relates to the AQIs themselves. As you recall from the concept release, we teed up 28 AQIs as potentially useful, and we were quite specific in what we thought those might be in order to elicit the most pointed comments during the comment process. And not surprisingly, some of those AQIs were quite controversial. And in particular, it's the ones that kind of broke new ground, the ones that are not commonly thought of or used today. So, for example, AQIs about the incentive system or the tone at the top within firms. As I mentioned, the scalability question is controversial. How much testing needs to be done to verify an AQI is somewhat controversial. Everybody agrees testing needs to be done, but some of the letters said, doggone it, you almost need to prove empirically that an AQI is useful to be able to, with confidence, use it. Others believe that far less testing is needed, even though some testing is needed. And then finally, a number of letters said, you know, all these AQIs are potentially very interesting, but what we really want to get to is the professional skepticism, objectivity, independence of the auditor. Can you help us think of some AQIs that would focus the discussion on those areas? Another area of controversy related to the question of the extent to which investors are a key customer of AQIs. The letters we received from investors passionately argued that investors are a key customer of AQIs. And of course, to meet that need, we would need to make AQIs public. Others argued passionately that investors should not be a key customer, direct customer of AQIs, for two broad reasons. One is understanding the AQIs requires context, and it would be very difficult to give an investor the appropriate context in which to evaluate the AQIs. And then other letters noted that investors are very busy folks, preoccupied with many, many issues in evaluating companies, and doubted whether investors would seriously pore over a portfolio of AQIs in order to evaluate audit quality. A third broad area of controversy relates to unintended consequences. Many of the letters warned us, as you have in the past, about unintended consequences. But where the controversy resides is what to do about the unintended consequences. What actions would we take to avoid having to make them? There, the letters offered a very diverse array of views. And then the final area of controversy relates to the question of should AQIs be mandated in some way, raising the issue of what is the highest and best use of an audit regulator in the AQI process. And here letters offered a spectrum of views. Some argued basically, but out, that these are early days, what we need is a continued experimentation, and right now we really don't see a major role for a regulator. Others argued passionately that the regulator offered a key role in helping to standardize vocabulary and have consistency of AQIs, and to ensure that a robust portfolio of AQIs are discussed, not only the good ones, but the ones where there's some bad and potentially some ugly that's present. And then letters were in between, offering that perhaps a role of regulation was to encourage, to offer insight, if not coming short of mandating the use of AQIs themselves. We offer this summary because we think these themes are going to come out in each of the breakout sessions, and we look forward to hearing your views on these important issues, as well as the other ones that were raised in the materials for today's meeting. So with that, let me turn it to Jane, who will discuss a little more detail about the breakout sessions today. Jane?
Thanks, Greg. Our breakout group sessions this morning will all concern the content and possible uses of a group of potential audit quality indicators. On the back of everyone's name tag includes a number, 1, 2, or 3, so that everyone is aware of which breakout session they will be participating in. The rooms are located upstairs, up the stairs to the right here. Group 1 will meet in room C, so in case it says room C or room 1, that will be our group 1. Group 2 will meet in room D, and we'll discuss the use of AQIs specifically by audit committee members. Group 1, I don't think I mentioned, will also discuss the AQIs and the content themselves. Group 3 will meet in room E, and we'll discuss the use of AQIs by investors. And then, as George mentioned earlier, tomorrow morning we will have an 8:30 a.m. debrief discussion. The first part of that discussion will include review of what was discussed during the breakout sessions, and we will seek comment from the other groups on each topic. We will also go round robin around the table and provide every member an opportunity to provide us a brief comment regarding what you believe the next step should be for the project. On each of the breakout groups, there will be a facilitator to moderate the discussion, as listed in the top row of the line there: Eugene, Greg, and Marty. The bottom line there, George, Steve, and myself will serve as an AQI team member in each of the breakout sessions. We will also have in each of the breakout sessions at least one board member participating in the discussions. Since we reordered the format this morning, Jim will speak after us. In the breakout sessions, there will be a 30-minute break before the breakout sessions begin. The breakout sessions are scheduled to begin promptly at 10:30, and then we'll end at 12:15 for lunch. Does anyone have questions about the format or any observations on the breakout sessions that they'd like to ask? Okay. We'll turn it over to the chairman now.
Thank you, Jane. I suspect it's well known to many of you that the staff of the PCAOB stays well ahead of the board through diligence and research and intelligence and preparation. It's long been suspected, I think, by some members of the board that there are unusual techniques employed to do this. This may represent a new height, a new level, or a new technique in terms of the staff staying ahead of the board. So we're here. Thank you for being here, and on with the business. Welcome to this November meeting of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board Standing Advisory Group. I want to thank SAG members and the observers for being here today. I want to take a few minutes to update you on the things we have been doing since the last update in June, but to note at the outset that, as with all board members and staff participating in the meeting, I'm not speaking for the board, only for myself, and expressing only my own views on different topics. Our Chief Auditor, Marty Baumann, has been said, will give you a detailed update on the status of our standard setting agenda this afternoon. As usual, I want to focus my update on other oversight activities to help put some of these standard setting initiatives in context. Nevertheless, both the board and the staff organization-wide have devoted considerable effort to the review of our standard setting program this year. And while most of the work is behind the scenes, I believe you will see the fruits of these efforts in our standard setting program in 2016. Staff in the Office of the Chief Auditor have been experimenting with new processes to make the standard-setting effort overall more efficient and to find opportunities to use data from our oversight activities more effectively. Economists from our Center for Economic Analysis are becoming more integrated and ingrained in the process daily, and going forward, robust economic analysis will be integrated fully into the projects from the outset. We're increasing also our outreach efforts on each project to obtain pertinent information from investors, auditors, and others. And some of the changes are apparent today in our meeting agenda that you've just had described as based on your suggestions. We will take advantage of the size of this group with experts from diverse professional backgrounds to hold multiple simultaneous conversations on the audit quality indicators in these breakout sessions, and we'll also have a new plenary session followed by breakout sessions on emerging issues, planned and led not by us, but by a subgroup of our own SAG members. We've included these features based on your feedback. Please keep it coming. In 2016, we plan to make a thorough review to examine whether there are additional ideas or changes that should be pursued to make the most effective use of this body and your time and advice. Behind the scenes, we've been working closely as a board, as well as with our colleagues at the SEC, on advancing the many important initiatives in our standard-setting agenda. These efforts should soon be apparent in December, when we expect the staff to present a final rule on audit transparency for the board's consideration. We've discussed our proposal to require disclosure of the name of the engagement partner and certain other firms involved in an audit, many times with the Standing Advisory Group over the last several years. In June, we issued a supplemental request for comment to evaluate an idea that emanated from previous comments. That is, to allow firms to file the disclosures in a publicly available form on the PCAOB website. Among other benefits, this would facilitate compilations of data for comparison and analysis. As we prepare the final rule, we've been working closely with our colleagues at the SEC, Chief Accountant Jim Schnurr, Deputy Chief Accountant Brian Croteau, and other colleagues in the Office of the Chief Accountant, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, and elsewhere in the Commission staff. And I'm grateful for their support for this initiative, without which we would not be in a position to bring this important initiative to fruition. Next year, we should be in a position to issue a new proposal on the auditor's reporting model, as well as proposals on the use of other auditors, on fair value measurements, and the use of specialists. These are all topics that have benefited from your counsel, as well as the counsel and support of the SEC staff. And I'll let Marty cover these projects in his remarks. But let me turn now to some other work, and I'll start with inspections. We're close to wrapping up our field work for the 2015 inspection cycle. With respect to the larger firm inspections, our inspectors are in the process of accumulating their findings and starting the report writing phase of the inspection work. Overall early results indicate that the number of deficiencies identified in the engagements inspected appears to be declining from the 2014 inspection results. These results vary for each firm. Not all firms saw a reduction in deficiencies. Inspection staff have continued to identify deficiencies in the same areas in 2015, including audits of internal control over financial reporting. As has been fairly widely reported, some issuers have expressed concerns about the effect of our inspections work in this area. As a result, we've been engaging in conversations with those parties to listen to their concerns and to consider how to improve communication and audit quality in this area, of which more later. The PCAOB has issued most inspection reports for the 2014 cycle. The reports issued so far indicate that inspection staff observed some modest improvements at certain U.S. domestic firms when compared to 2013 results. Recently, we issued a general report discussing our observations related to the implementation of the risk assessment standards implemented in 2012. The report discusses the observations of our inspection staff for the 2012, 2013, and 2014 inspection cycles. Because risk assessment underlies the entire audit process, it is critical that audit firms address these findings of weakness in their compliance with the risk assessment standards. We also continue to develop our broker-dealer auditor oversight. In August, the board issued its fourth annual report on our interim inspection program. The 2015 inspection cycle is in progress, and by the end of the year, we will have inspected 75 audit firms and portions of 115 broker-dealer audit and attestation engagements. Beginning late last year, inspectors began to evaluate audits of brokers and dealers against the PCAOB's own audit standards, as opposed to the AICPA standards previously in effect. At about the same time these standards went into effect, brokers and dealers themselves became subject to the SEC's new post-Madoff reporting requirements. We're coordinating closely with the Commission staff in monitoring implementation of the amended rule and the PCAOB standards, including our new auditor attestation standards. Consistent with the first 3 annual reports on results of our interim inspection, our August 2015 report described high levels of independence findings on audit deficiencies. Inspectors identified deficiencies across all types of audit firms, but firms that did not also audit issuers were noted to have a higher percentage of findings and deficiencies than firms that also audited issuers. Given the continued high level of findings, we've been urging firms that audit broker-dealers to re-examine their audit approaches. One purpose of the interim inspection program is to gather data about audit practices in the broker-dealer industry to inform development of a permanent program, including whether any exemptions from the program would be appropriate. This is work for 2016. The new program will be established by rule after notice, public comment, and as is the case with all of our rules, SEC approval. Economic analysis. Let me turn to this and give you an update on the status of our new Center for Economic Analysis. Center staff has devoted, by the way, it pointed out to me that it's now getting on 2 years old, so it is the Center for Economic Analysis. Center staff has devoted considerable time to the economic analysis for the initiatives on transparency, other auditors, specialists, and going concern. The Center has kicked off a post-implementation review program starting with AS7, our standard on engagement quality reviews. The standard was expressly required by Sarbanes-Oxley in order to improve on and replace the profession's concurring partner requirements. So that's an important post-implementation review for us. We'll soon publish a request for comment on how engagement quality reviews have worked and whether they've made a difference. Concurrently with this work, Center staff is examining the existing literature and organizing data on these reviews gathered through the inspection process. So there is coordination here. The Center also recently held its second economic conference, again jointly with the prestigious Journal of Accounting Research, at which auditors of 6 different papers presented their work. The conference led to interesting discussions and was well attended, including 120 scholars. In attendance, too, were editors of the 5 top academic journals, which bodes well for the future of auditing research as a subject of interest to the broader academic community. And we intend to do what we can to foster that. The Center's Economic Research Fellows Program, inaugurated in the fall of 2014 with the work of the first 2 fellows, has started to bear fruit with 5 working papers. And these papers are now in various stages of peer review, and they're being presented at universities around the country. Finally, the Center is hard at work with our inspectors on other groundbreaking initiatives to consider, for example, whether to devote some portion of inspection resources to randomly selected engagements. That could further efforts to make inferences about how pervasive audit deficiencies are in the industry and potentially increase the deterrent effect of our inspections program. Enforcement. Speaking of deterrence, several contested matters are currently working their way through our process. As you know, by law we can't announce our enforcement proceedings unless and until either a settlement is reached or a party has had an opportunity to appeal a sanction to the SEC, and the SEC has lifted the statutory stay on the sanction taking effect. I can say, though, that we've stepped up enforcing compliance with our requirements by registered non-U.S. firms. We have several pending investigations and proceedings involving work by those firms. I expect more of our enforcement resources than in years past will be focused on possible violations of our requirements by registered non-U.S. firms. In all of this work, we coordinate closely with the Commission's Division of Enforcement, including in our mutual efforts to leverage data and analysis to allocate enforcement resources efficiently. Some other work. We've been active in some other areas. Our outreach to audit committees continues. In 2015, we signed bilateral cooperative agreements with regulators in Greece Hungary, and Luxembourg. As a result, we now have concluded altogether 13 bilateral cooperative agreements in Europe, and we're closing the gap on access to inspection in a handful of remaining European jurisdictions where there are registered firms that we need to inspect. At the same time, we're well on our way to achieving a renewal of the EC's 2013 adequacy determination, and this will allow our work with local regulators in Europe to continue and deepen beyond 2016 when the current adequacy determination expires. We also continue our efforts to negotiate access to inspect registered firms in China, notwithstanding some media reports to the contrary a couple of weeks ago. While substantial progress has been made, coming to closure has proved to be more difficult than we'd anticipated. Besides our negotiating counterparts at the CSRC and the the Finance Ministry, it now seems there are a number of other different authorities in China that have a say in the final Chinese negotiating position, and this has complicated the closeout phase of our talks. It has become clear to me that it's very difficult to move up in the understanding of the Chinese authorities, the full realization of what our inspections are, that we're inspecting audit work papers, we're not doing forensic diligence on corporations, that there's confidentiality, that some of our findings in Part 2 never become public. There are a number of features of the PCAOB inspection and remediation process that members of this advisory committee and many members throughout the country are familiar with that simply have not permeated other echelons of Chinese thought, I think. But we're getting there. We continue to enjoy the strong support of the SEC and the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. State Department, both in pressing for access and in standing firm on the basic investor protections that undergird the process. While I can provide no assurance that we will ultimately succeed, we continue to be in close contact with our counterparts in the People's Republic of China. And also, since we last spoke, we've issued a concept release on audit quality indicators, as has been noted, and this is based in large part, of course, on the advice of this group, as my colleagues noted. And we all look forward to discussing that project at length, and as later is scheduled in the meeting. And with that, I look forward to what I always do in the Standing Advisory Group, which is our exchange and your questions or comments.
So please, we're interested in any questions or comments anyone might have regarding anything that the chairman may have said or anything else you've heard so far. And Rick Murray, you're recognized.
Thank you, Marty. And Jim, thank you for your remarks, which are essential to all of our deliberations here. I particularly appreciated, Jim, your comments about the new initiative on emerging issues at this meeting and the board's intentions to use 2016 as a time to explore the continued improvement in interactions and contribution by the SAG to the board's work. At the last SAG meeting, I expressed some concerns about the current structures and procedures in which SAG operates. Specifically, I'm worried and said I have been about basically two things: our opportunity to be the kind of contributing center and deliberative body as contemplated by the board and by SOX, and also about our ability to carry out those functions if the opportunity were presented. I am grateful particularly to the time that Marty and the staff have spent with me since that meeting to explore the issues and the ways forward. I welcome the Emerging Issues Initiative, Jim, as a very positive response. It is a response that addresses the first of those concerns. That is, it seems an appropriate way to explore how we get the opportunity to contribute early in the thinking process and influence the standard-setting agenda where it's appropriate. It does not by itself seem to address the questions of ability. That is, we remain, as currently constituted, as a body with no capacity to form a collective view or to have a mechanism for expressing that view or delivering it to the board in the manner of contribution to the board's considerations. It's an issue that I think is manifested well at this meeting as we spend so much time and effort trying to remember and agree upon what we thought when we last met and gave extensive consideration to AQIs and the work use of specialists. Recovering our prior thought is difficult, and that doesn't seem to be a conducive contribution to our advising the board.
Richard, it's not usual to interrupt, but the others, including myself, may lack context to really fully appreciate the last remark. Can you be more specific? What do you mean by that?
Fairly simple-minded answer, Jim. We don't have a means of communicating with one another. We are not a body that has a voice, that is a place where members can contribute. We aren't asked what our collective views are, and we don't have an opportunity to create minutes. We don't. All of our functions.
Well, on the other hand, there are records of this meeting. They're available to members, and there may be not a collective view. I guess, Richard, one of the things that struck me over the years is that I've been here is that the strength of the SAG seems to reside in the great diversity of the views that are exhibited, and the fact that people carry away from these meetings and then bring back to these meetings viewpoints that are continuously contributed to us in standard setting by comment letters and by their comments at the meeting. Do you think it's necessary there be kind of a voting session of the SAG, even when members may disagree on how much effort should go into a particular aspect of the standard? Is that what you're at?
Jim, the board's commissioning of SAG says we are supposed to take votes. That may or may not be a good idea, but it is certainly something that hasn't been brought to us for consideration in the years that I've been familiar with it.
We'll be interested to hear what other SAG members may think about this, but we can carry on.
Could I finish, Jim? Your question is the right question. That is, what does it matter? We are currently 42 people who maintain a very positive, unilateral, one-on-one relationship with the board through the staff. But as a deliberative body, the only way we have to communicate or to express thought is through the chairing function of the PCAOB staff. And without a voice or a mind that is otherwise separate from the staff process, which is doing what it is supposed to do in its responsibilities, it's difficult for us to recognize what we are collectively as opposed to being accumulation of the 42 thoughts.
I'm not aware of any restrictions on the freedom of association that the PCAOB imposes on people. I am always grateful, personally, for the amount of time that people who are very important in their own organizations and do a lot in real jobs devote to the SAG by coming here twice a year for a full 24 hours and plus. We say we're grateful for the SAG, and that's what we mean. These are people, all of them, who have important things to say. I'm not aware of any restriction that's placed on them in writing editorials or composing comment letters and doing all the things they do normally in a busy day, in addition to running their own businesses.
Doug, did you want to...
Jim, I don't mean to create an issue for the sake of creating an issue. Let me be as direct as I can. The board of the PCAOB has established ground rules for the operation of the SAG, which are quite specific. Those ground rules are not in operation, and as one SAG member, I believe we suffer in our ability to make a contribution back to the board because they are not.
I think, Doug, did you put your card up in response to these comments to keep this dialogue, or something separate? Did you put your card up in response to the comments? Okay, Joan?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I think a couple of things. I agree with Rick. I think it's very positive the way that you're addressing emerging issues. I think the PCAOB should be applauded for that, and I think that's a really nice first step in response to the question of, gee, it would be great to get the input of a very large body, and that's one way to start. And it's kind of a pilot, I would say. My guess is it's not going to be perfect, but we'll learn from it, and I think as long as we're flexible and keep moving, I think that's great. And I guess two things that I would think about in terms of the comments that Rick just made and what the PCAOB is doing. And I would say, I should preface this with, I think it's very positive that you're getting this feedback, because that means people are engaged and they want to continue for improvement. When people don't provide comments anymore, that's a bad thing. So I think we're in a good space from that perspective, and I say that with all respect. I also think that, typically with the board situation, when you have, I'll call it a charter, however you're going to describe your rules of engagement, they're in, I think it's 2003-09, if that's the right section. Generally what you'll see with the board, and I'd like to have consideration of this, is every year when you have a charter, you kind of measure yourself against that and say, gee, this is what our charter was. Did we achieve it? And we kind of do a self-assessment. And I guess I wonder, is that part of our process, and should it be, and should we consider it? Because boards generally do that because it's a healthy way to for continuous improvement. And it also says, let's check our charter, because maybe the way we've established it, we want to make changes. And I know we have that latitude to do that. So that's really one question. I put that under the guise of governance. What did we say we were going to do? How do we measure up against that? And should we have any changes, and kind of a self-assessment? So that would involve a lot of input. And so I guess my second point that I'd like to make is, just as we, with the emerging issues, tried to identify a number of people that represented some of the key stakeholders within our group, maybe we could think about some of Rick's points of, gee, how are we engaged? What are our policies? What are our procedures? We've been around for a while. Every company and every organization can always get better. You're hearing that people really want to get their voice in. Maybe it would be a time for us to think about identifying, I just throw this out as a model, but think of it more as a framework and then react to it. But maybe we should identify like a representative from each of the key stakeholders within the group and allow them as an example to reach out to, okay, I'm an audit committee chairperson, so maybe somebody like myself would reach out to all the people that are audit committee members. Somebody like Mike that's representing the firms could reach out to all the members that relate to the firms and get their input on how we're doing things and, pros and cons and what we could think about. And then maybe get that group together with Marty, with you, and Brian from the SEC, just to provide our input, because it seems like it's timely, because I know that that you've commissioned a review of the standard setting function, and it actually might be a great way to provide, I don't know whether that review process, since I'm fairly new to the organization, I don't know whether the organization that you've hired has reached out to SAG members or not, but it would be a nice way to give kind of collective view to that body, because I would think they'd want to know kind of our thoughts. And it might also be and I don't know, for example, and it would be great to get an update on this, with that review that's being held, what is our role going to be? Are we going to get an update on that? Is it done, almost done? Do we have any views for that? But, I've said a lot of things, so I'll come to the beginning as I end. I think it's good what you're doing to seek input. I think we have a great opportunity to take that model and apply it to other areas. I'm thrilled to hear that people want to have continuous improvement, because that's how organizations get better. And I'm hopeful that other SAG members feel the same way and want to be engaged, in some way, even if it's a different way that I've just articulated. And I put this all, like I said, under the guise of good governance.
Thanks, Joan, and I appreciate your comments about the Emerging Issues Group. I think it is a outstanding, I appreciate your efforts for being on it, but to get 5 SAG members to say, leave it up to you, you come to us with the agenda of what the emerging issues are, I think is a very good way to get input from the SAG. And I do hope that others have given thought to that topic, so that when this is presented tomorrow, other SAG members support other items that want to be discussed. As Jim said, with respect to your main point, in Jim's comments indicated, and as part of the overall review of how we're operating and standard setting at the PCAOB, we do plan in 2016 to take a look at the activities of the Standing Advisory Group and are there ways in which we can operate more efficiently, more effectively, and while you're a great advisory group, are there better ways to use the talents of all the people in this room? So we've taken that point on and plan to do it in 2016. Was somebody else's follow-up on the same point or other points on Jim's remarks? Jim Cox?
Yeah, I think I'm in my 6th year. I've lost track of being on this. I think it's an amazing group, and I think how you view this, Rick, is a matter of where you sit and where you've sat. And so I spent my whole career in an academic setting where our hallmarks of the strengths of places that I've been, I've taught at 5 different institutions, is the strength of the collaborative process, which actually, despite all the sort of snide remarks one make about academics, we accomplish quite a lot. We're sustainable, and I think we will be sustained. I think this is, if you start resorting to votes, I think you have a destructive effect on getting the range of viewpoints and clarity that you would have in the, this is a round table, although we're in a square right now, but round table discussions, and I've never left any of these meetings without having a clear idea of what was on both sides and the intensity of both those sides, and I think that's the function we serve with our staff. If you start resolving to votes, then I believe you're going to not have that degree of clarity around it. In fact, you'll be sort of ring-fencing so many of the issues. So I would strongly disagree. I understand how, if you've not been in a collaborative enterprise, but I actually think that this is the mode we would like to have.
Marty, could I make a quick comment? I couldn't agree with you more, Jim. I am not proposing as a proper policy that we start taking votes with everything that comes before us. I think it would be a bad idea for the same reasons. But the board says we're supposed to do that. There is an existing written protocol that says we must take votes, make decisions, make recommendations, and submit them in writing to the board. Those may be obnoxious overextensions of how we could organize deliberatively, but they're there, and we ignore them. I think somewhere between what's written and what's right for the day, there are ways we can make better and more effective contribution, because that's what we're here to do.
I just want to comment on that, Rick, and then I'd like to move on. The release, the 2003 release, clearly specifies the roles of the SAG, and it talks about the role of the SAG in assisting the board in reviewing existing standards, evaluating proposed standards recommended by the board, and recommending to the board new or amended standards. And the board will look to the SAG to provide advice and insight as to the need to formulate new standards or change existing standards, and the impact of proposed or new changes. And it talks about the diversity in the SAG and the diverse views that we're looking to get. And the only aspect where it talks about any voting is, if so directed by the chair of the SAG, we may convene hearings on a particular matter, and if that is so convened and we seek to get a vote on a matter, then we'll get that vote. But it's not a matter of voting on all issues or all matters brought before the SAG. So that's not an accurate statement. But they can be, but we can convene hearings for purposes of a vote. But given the diverse views of the SAG, that's not the general purpose. I do want to entertain some others in the room.
But I have to comment. That same document in the passages you're referring to say that the first chairman of the SAG in 2003 was to be the then chief auditor of the PCAOB. Seems a strong implication that that was to be a limited period and that a chair would emerge from within SAG who would be the focal point of deciding what we want to do. It is inhibiting, in my view, not that you are not doing a good job as chair, you clearly do, but your role is one that is inconsistent with being the mind and the voice of the SAG.
Thank you. Ken Gold. We haven't...
Is this still on? Yeah, I guess it is. I don't have the, I'm not going to go even get close to that one. And I don't have the context. This is my only second meeting, but it just strikes me a couple of general comments I was going to make. One is I was on FASIC for a number of years, and I still see the materials, and to me it's always good to get a sense of the collective thoughts of everyone as to what the priority should be for the group. And maybe we've done that here, maybe we haven't, I don't know. Which gets me thinking, I sort of had a tough night, so I started reading a little bit on the KPMG report, and I got to thinking, and it said there was was actually a greater number of deficiencies, so to speak, this time than last time, and so forth and so forth. And I just wonder, and then I think about, we're going to discuss quality today, and then I also remember talking to Bob Hurth, and I remember talking about quality back in the Treasury Subcommittee a decade ago. So I just sort of think of all this together and sort of say, how do we ultimately accomplish something where we actually make effectively progress in improving the quality, if you will, of the audits, part of which is the reports that PCAOB does come out on the various firms. To the extent they're not making progress, there's either a disconnect between what PCAOB expects, what the firms themselves can really accomplish, and I don't want to make a comment either way, but it'd just be good to sort of think about, because that is one of the major functions, I think, of PCAOB. It relates to the quality of the audits, and I think of everything a lot of what we do is how to support that aspect of what we do. So anyway, that's just my sort of overall thinking about how we think about 16, what the priorities are, how we think about the reports. And it was good seeing one on KPMG, because sometimes I see ones on firms, frankly, I've never heard of, and I sort of don't look at them very closely. But on something on the Big Four, obviously it does take you back to look at them and see if there's any, and what I'm really also trying to find when I read those as a practitioner is what can I glean from that would be helpful for me understanding what are the overriding messages from that. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thanks. Just a brief comment on that, Ken. I'll talk later on about the audit standards projects, but one of them deals about the quality controls of firms, which really are behind the aspects of whether or not firms can improve the performance on their audits in terms of improved quality controls. But the quality control standards and updating them go in line with some other things. But what we're talking about with Greg's session today in the breakout of audit quality indicators is, well, are there indicators of quality that can be measured and looked at and help firms improve that quality and the performance of their audits? And that's a key aspect of that discussion. I don't know if you want to add to this, Greg. But in addition to that, inspections, beyond just giving inspections reports, has been going through a very deep root cause analysis with respect to their inspections of the various firms, looking at those audits that were deficient and why were they deficient, what was the root cause of that, and at the same time looking at the other audits that they looked at where they didn't have negative comments and what was different in those audits and why were those audits successful and didn't have deficiencies. So I think the combination of the Audit Quality Indicator Project, digging into the root causes of deficiencies in audits and comparing high-quality audits to ones that have deficiencies and trying to see what we can glean out of that to inform a quality control project and other aspects to inform a quality control project to update the standards, I think are ways in which we can get all of that to hopefully improve our quality. Next, Jessica. Doug Main.
I'm going to change the subject here. In May, you all made available something called the Audit Committee Dialogue, which I found to be extremely helpful. But in it, you shine a light on ICFR, and your report says that we've gone from 15% deficiencies in ICFR in 2010 to 39% in 2013. And Jim, it sounded as though you're saying that the most recent year we're still at that 39% level. This seems like a three-alarm fire to me. What's going on? Is there something different with your inspection process? Are you doing a root cause on this?
It's a lively topic, Doug. I think first, the inspection process has striven for and I think achieved a lot of consistency. We've also had a lot of talk with the firms, including some of the firm representatives here present, which suggests to us that they are recognizing areas where they can strengthen the communication skills in how you do an internal control audit. As I alluded to in a very passing way in the remarks, Jim Schnur and I have tried to make a special effort to meet with preparers. We have met with preparers, we have met with audit firms, and we have met with groups of CFOs and others. That's going to be an ongoing process. But out of it comes a number of phenomena. One is it's clear that communication between the audit firm and the management of the company could be improved, that there could be better communication of why an internal control audit needs to be changed from the previous year, what kind of procedures are going to be useful. And those meetings and discussions, I think, are going to bear fruit with the panel at the AICPA meeting in December. That's a good thing. And that won't be the end of it. We'll carry it on. Not to suggest that firms are doing worse in this area. I think it is a continuing structural support for good auditing that we have an integrated audit and an audit of internal control of financial reporting, and I think management is coming to actually believe that. I think if it's a case in which the recognition of the importance of good internal controls is well understood in the C-suite, and you've spoken eloquently in these meetings about that. I think you said at one of our earlier meetings that if you don't think your auditor is looking at internal controls and you can't discuss what they are looking at, you've got the wrong auditor. You need to worry about that. It is clear, as I said, that we're getting better results across firms from 2013. And it's clear also that it's not uniform, that some firms are better at this than others. That's why in our reports we say no one should make conclusions about a specific audit report on a firm about the quality of the firm's auditing overall or about the implications for the industry. So I think it is very much in the forefront of our minds to try to recognize where remediation has improved this aspect of audit as well as others.
But Doug, you certainly touched on a key item, and that is it's getting a lot of dialogue, as Jim Doty said, amongst us, the SEC, preparers and auditors to delve into these issues. Brian, did you have a follow-up on this point?
I do, yeah. Thank you very much. And just to add on to the remarks Chairman Doty made and Marty, Doug, I share your concerns. Probably a good time to say that this disclaimer you heard this morning applies to me as well. But I share your concerns. It's an area that, from an SEC staff perspective, we have been spending a significant amount of time on. I don't think what you're seeing in the PCAOB's inspection reports is limited to an auditing issue. It's an area where we would like to see some incremental focus and better communications, I think. And to get a sense for at least some of what we've heard initially, I would refer you perhaps in the meantime to remarks that Jim Schnur delivered about a month ago that are posted on our website that I think lay out at least the start of what we've heard, and I think you'll continue to see us working closely with the PCAOB, soliciting additional feedback, and then through public remarks hearing more about what we've heard and what we think can be done. But I do think there's signs of improvement and there's signs of focus here, and I think that's what's really important right now. So I just wanted to add to Chairman Doty and Marty's remarks.
Thanks, Brian. Philip Johnson.
Thanks, Marty. I don't want to prolong the discussion that Rick started, but I do have one or two comments on it because, like you, I sat on the CAG of the IAASB, so I've seen a similar format of meeting of this, normally similar size. And I think that the comments that are made around the CAG table at the IAASB are similar. So we've got a similar group and similar comments. I don't ever recall whether there's been a voting mechanism or been a vote. Certainly when I was there, I was there for 6 years. I don't think that there was a vote, and I'm not in favour of voting in this type of context, because one listens to views, and standard setting is an iterative process. It's not black and white. So I wouldn't be in favour of voting. I think the two major differences between the two organisations and the two advisory groups is that the IAASB CAG does have an independent chair that is appointed from the SAG members with a fixed term, and that chair does follow up the points raised by the CAG with the board, and so there is that direct conduit between the advisory group and the board. And the second major difference, I think, is that there is a report back process to the advisory group, a written report back where substantive and specific comments or concerns, where they are raised in the advisory group, then they do come back in written form of how those comments and concerns have been addressed. They're not always taken up, quite rightly, but there is a view that is a useful mechanism to ensure that things don't get lost through the passage of time between meetings, and so I think that is a useful mechanism. So that, I think we all learn from the activities of others, and so I just thought I'd make that point of how the other organisation, or the other advisory group, covers off some of these points.
Right, and I'm with you in terms of my attendance at those CAG meetings for many of the, still, but for many of the years that you were there. And it does operate in a similar manner with very diverse points of view given to the chair, who the chair then takes to the standards board to say, here's some views of the CAG members on what you're proposing as standards. And obviously we get that because the standards group is here, and the full board is actually at this meeting. And in our releases on any standards, not only with respect to comments we hear at SAG, which are often noted in the releases on a standard, but we point out both commenters' written comment letters and SAG member comments that either supported or opposed an idea and why we accepted or didn't accept. But good points you've made, and more for us to think about in this regard. Sir David Tweedy.
Thanks, Marty. I wasn't going to comment until Philip brought the matter up again, but I disagreed with Rick last time, and I certainly disagree with him this time again, and I thought I may as well put my views on record that the issue about an advisory group is quite difficult. I've been in the receiving end as chairman of ISB, of advisory groups, and if you're going to start to go voting, what are you going to do with the vote? And what legitimacy has it? Because we had 3 different iterations of our advisory council in the ISB. The first one consisted mainly of people who had wanted to get on the ISB and didn't make it. That was an absolute disaster because they wanted to second guess everything the board did. The second one were more random, but then we didn't know where people were coming from. And the third one we tried was on the basis, well, can we have so many from industry, so many from the profession, and so on. And you have to move round in that area. We're a pretty motley bunch around this table, and what we're really after, I think, is just getting insights, and then the insights you get as a standard setter, you take those into account, and frankly, one view can change everything, even if it's a minority view. And you find the same in due process. It's not the sheer volume that you get saying, leasing's a terrible idea. It's only taken 20 years to convince everyone it isn't. But you actually look at the views that sort of make a difference, saying, well, have you thought about X? You think, no, I haven't. That's a good point, and that's what you take in. And that's where I think the value of this is. I don't think votes make any difference whatsoever. If people have got blue faces and knotted veins, you know they feel strongly about something. And you don't have to go counting how many got these knotted veins. You get the impression of the meeting. I have no problems with the way this has been handled, and I don't think we want to get bogged down in procedural issues. Take the views, you take them, you use them, due process takes care of the rest of it, and ultimately the board has to make its mind up. We can't keep second-guessing it.
So David, thanks for those comments. Scott Showalter?
Thank you. This is my 5th year on the SAG and my last meeting, so I would be remiss if I didn't make a comment from the academic side. But if you don't realize this, Jim and I were coming in this morning, I made a comment to him, Jim Cox, not Jim Doty, this morning that I thought the PCAOB was the most open to academic research of being the standard setters I ever come across. I think you usually start with the question, what is available, and start working on that. And I think the PCAOB JAR conference is an example of that engagement. You also saw during that meeting that academics struggled with the fact that your inspection process is not random. So I'm getting back to your point, Jim, about thinking about the random process. So if you want to be better informed by the academic process, the randomness of the inspection process, maybe it'll allow that to take place to help identify more root causes. So I wonder if you could explain a little more about where you're headed with that, because from an academic perspective, I think you could get some real benefits from that. I was asking Chairman Doty, Jim, not you. But
well, I was hoping you had me covered then. We will spend substantial time with academics in different quarters thinking about what could be done by way of randomization and what our data permits us to do. It will yield, we think, some insights on where we can gather different kinds of data. The inspection process is a big ship. You don't turn it on a dime. We don't want to do that. We want to enhance the effectiveness of it. We want to start adding credibility to what the inspection process has found and does find, and to do that by improving the tools will be a long-term exercise for us. Sri Ramamurthy.
I put up my card quite a while ago, so I want to follow up on the original comments made by Rick and followed up by Joan. In my opinion, SAG participation is ultimately a function of the relevance, the quality, and the frequency of communications. And we live here in the 21st century, and with my experience now in blended learning environments, including teaching in fully online classes, a very straightforward solution for the PCAOB to explore might be to create a PCAOB-hosted chat room with discussion threads and things like that, just for the use of SAG members. But this will be PCAOB hosted, so the PCAOB will have complete access to it, and they know what kind of communications are taking place. And you could also post documents, everything. And so I think that would be incredibly effective in getting more camaraderie, collegiality among the PCAOB SAG members, and would ultimately result in, I think, a very good high-quality counsel being delivered to the PCAOB. So.
Good, thanks for that comment. Sarah Lewis.
I just had a quick comment too to follow up on Rick and Joan, and I can tell you, having spent more than 11 years as a board member for 5 public companies, we are expected to, as a corporate issuer, follow good governance and have the best governance we can have as a corporate issuer. And of course, we're rated by, proxy advisors every year on that. Again, investors expect corporate issuers to follow strong corporate governance guidelines. And of course, we're expecting that from the accounting firms. So I just think it's natural that as a body that we at SAG should want to follow good governance ourselves and have some type of mechanism, at least on an annual basis, to review, what our charter is and what we're actually doing and could it be better. So I support a movement toward good governance.
Thanks. Joan Amble?
Thank you. I just wanted to bring it back to governance as well, and I think you stated it very well, so I won't state it again, because I don't think the point was to identify, change this, let's debate it, and try to conclude today. The point was, look, we've got things that we say, our procedures, are we doing them, how are we faring, and how can we continuously improve, and not to debate voting or not voting and reporting and how you report. So I think we're in sync from that perspective. And thank you for, giving us this opportunity to express a view.
We appreciate all of the input and all the thoughts, and as Jim said, we'll take a further look at 2016 about how we operate and look for further continuous improvement. I think it's as you said it.
Yeah, and I think you're hearing that people want to help and be involved and be a part of that process, which I think, like I said, is a very good thing.
Great, thank you. Maureen McNichols.
Thank you. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge, and echoing Scott Showalter's comments, the very significant commitment that the PCAOB has undertaken toward outreach to academics. We've seen that in the center, in the boards, each individual board member's outreach in terms of visiting classes, presenting at the AAA, chairing sessions at the PCAOB JAR conference. Scott and I were both recently at a conference in Canada, a Contemporary Accounting Research Conference, where the impact of the PCAOB's outreach was very visible in the research that was being presented. So I just want to highlight how important that is. A key finding from personal experience as well as significant research is that the best predictor of what students learn is what their teachers know. And so if we want to inform the next generation of auditors, it's crucial that academics are as informed as they can be, and I just really want to recognize how important the board's efforts have been to making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Okay, we appreciate all the comments that everybody has given us and the advice and the differing views, and we'll take that all into account as we always do. I wanted to mention, I want to turn to Greg in a second for one more thing, but before I do that, there's one more item in your folder that I didn't mention early on, and that's a document that says PCAOB Auditing Standards Reorganized and Legacy Numbering. So that's a tool for you as you assist us in thinking about the various different standards that we ask you to look at from time to time. We've talked about this over the last several meetings, that we were completing and working on a reorganization of our standards. In March of this year, we completed that project to integrate our standards. The interim standards that were remaining, that had not been superseded, that we adopted in 2003 from the profession, as well as the adopted standards that the board has adopted over the many years, the AS standards, AS 1 through 18. And we have proposed and reproposed a reorganization of those standards, and the board approved that, and in September the SEC approved the amendments and the reorganization of the auditing standards. The amendments are effective as of December 31, 2016. However, auditors may begin to use and reference those reorganized auditing standards immediately. And in documents that we are putting out, we are beginning to reference the reorganized standards, as well as, at least for the short term until 2016, the legacy standards. I think as you'll look at this, the reorganization presents the standards in a logical flow, really about how someone thinks about the audit process. There's the general auditing standards, general concepts about auditing, and then followed by the 2000 series on audit procedures, starting with planning, procedures responding to risk, specific aspects of the audit, and then procedures for certain accounts and disclosures in the 2000 series and 3000 series auditor reporting. The reorganized standards are now on our website. When you go onto standards, you can see, do you want to look at the reorganized standards, or do you want to look at the standards before reorganization? And there's tools that enables one to crosswalk between the reorganized standards and the legacy standards for a while, so people can make sure they get back and forth to the right one. And there's also tools to refer to the analogous standards where they exist, of the IAASB or the ASB. And so it is up on our website, and we also wanted to give you this handy tool to have on your desktop, so that when you were looking at a PCAOB standard and suddenly you thought you were thinking about AS5 in the past, and now it's called AS2201, you know what it is. So this is a handy reference tool going forward. The last thing I wanted to cover is a question I want to give to Greg before we break out. And that is, Greg, can you tell us what you hope to accomplish in the breakout rooms? What would you like to see those breakout rooms do and accomplish and come back with?
Marty, when we put together the agenda for AQIs, we were really trying to put each SAG member in position to do what we believe to be the main event on AQIs, which will be tomorrow. When we go around the room and hear your personal recommendation to the board as to what steps the board takes, if any, related to the AQI project. We know that many of you have had the benefit of prior SAG discussions on AQIs, the AQI concept release, the comment letters, the staff's analysis of the comment letters that we had for today's meeting, then the benefit of the breakout sessions that you'll have, and the debrief tomorrow morning, all of which we hope puts you in position to be comfortable rendering your personal advice to the board. So, Marty, that's really what we're trying to accomplish overall. With regard to the breakouts, what we'd like to do in the debrief session on just the breakouts tomorrow is to summarize points in three categories. One, what are the areas of general agreement across stakeholder groups within the discussion topic that you have? Two, where is the essential controversy and the underlying rationale behind that controversy for the alternative views? And then finally, what new thinking, what new ideas came up in the breakouts that you didn't see in the concept release? Marty?
Great. With that, and we appreciate all the comments in this first general session, we now go to a coffee break, and then the breakout assignments again are, I think, on your badge and in your folder. We'll convene after the breakout sessions is lunch, and then we convene back at 12:15. And then we come back here at 1:15 for the discussion about standard setting, agenda update, and then we go into the emerging issues. So we'll see you in the breakout rooms. Thanks. Okay, thanks everybody and for getting back on time from lunch. And I hope everyone enjoyed and had a good breakout session and lively discussion. Certainly I was in one room and we certainly filled up all of the time we had and probably could have used more. So I think it was, from my perspective, a well-spent time. I want to turn to our standard setting agenda, as I said, a copy of which is in your folder and which we publish on our website, and the most recent agendas as of September 30th. And I'll talk briefly about some of these projects, seeking your input as I go along, and put your card up, please, at any time to ask a question about anything or to suggest other directions or other projects or whatever you'd like to add. So don't wait till the end. I'll answer questions at any point during this discussion. The first project I want to talk about is the one that's been on our agenda for quite a while, improving transparency through the disclosure of engagement partner and other participants in the audit. This goes back to the recommendation from the Treasury's Advisory Committee on the auditing profession. And the initial recommendation, as you all may recall, was that the PCAOB require that the engagement partner sign the audit report in his or her own name in addition to the firm's name. And the thought of the advisory committee was that would improve audit quality by improving the accountability of the audit partner by the physical nature of signing his or her name to the audit report. That was discussed in a concept release, and then later on in a proposal we moved from signature because of concerns around some liability aspects of signing and what that might bring in terms of the maker of the statement, into a disclosure of the name of the engagement partner in the audit report, and also added another element, and that was disclosure of other firms that participated in the audit over a certain threshold. Comments on that proposal and reproposal still raised concerns with respect to a number of commenters with respect to continued liability issues with respect to audit firms, the audit partners being named in the audit report, and also some practical issues that the naming of the engagement partner and the other firms would trigger Section 7 consent requirements and maybe some Section 11 liability requirements. So we've looked at the ways to solve this issue, and some firms had suggested, why don't we consider a form disclosure outside of the audit report. And so we proposed that in a supplemental request for comment in June of this year, and the comment period closed on August 31st. We received 48 comment letters on that supplemental request for comment, and commenters were generally supportive of moving to a disclosure of the engagement partner and the other firms that participated in the audit, again, over a certain threshold, in this new form, Form AP, audit participants, to be filed shortly after the audit and be on our website, where that information would be available to anybody who'd want to get it, and it would be in a searchable database. The information with the engagement partner I talked about, and the history behind that was triggered by accountability. The history behind the other participants was a number of things. First of all, in a multinational engagement, there can be many other firms doing a lot of the work. Maybe 60% of the audit is done by other firms. And each of those firms may have very different inspection reports than the primary firm signing the report. So it gives the ability of a user to understand who did the audit and the quality of the work done by not just the primary firm, but by the other firms. In addition, we became aware of situations over the years through inspections and elsewhere where a U.S. firm might be signing a report, but an extensive amount of work, 90+% of the audit work, was being done by some other firm, and sometimes in a jurisdiction where we couldn't inspect. That was not transparent to investors at all. Their assumption was the firm that signed the audit report in the U.S. did the audit. And so the disclosure of the other participants in the audit over a certain threshold does shed light on who did the audit, how much of the work was done by the lead audit firm who's signing the report, and how much was done by others. So given the support that we received, we are moving ahead to ask the board to adopt Form AP. We hope to do this in December. We did receive a number of comments that the staff has been following up on regarding some implementation considerations, and we've been giving careful attention to that, including such as what the effective date would be. We proposed June 30th as the effective date 2016, and some said by the time it got SEC approval, would that be enough time for all of us to get processes in place for disclosure? So we're considering that. The filing deadline, we proposed 30 days after the end of the report being filed. Some investors wanted it shorter. Some others said we need more time, so we're considering that. Firms wanted to know if they could file forms in a batch process, not just one at a time, but a batch filing. And then some academics asked that there be unique identifiers with respect to individual partners, as it's very possible that partners could have the same name in different firms. Two partners may have the same name in the same firm, or that through marriage or divorce, people can change their name. And therefore, if the benefit of the disclosure in the database was to see someone's history over time, maybe you'd lose that ability if you didn't really have the same name over time, or confuse names with people who had a common name. And so we are considering unique identifiers as well. So we have addressed all of these comments, and as I said, we are moving forward and expect to ask the board to approve the disclosure of the engagement partner and other participants on Form AP. Hopefully we'll bring this to a vote for the board in December. The second item I'd like to talk about is the project on supervision of other, again, anytime you have questions, put your cards up. Supervision of other auditors and in multi-location audits. In many cases, firms are following AU 543, use of the reports of other auditors with respect to multinational engagements. 543 has requirements as to how the primary firm uses the report and work of other auditors, but does not include a lot about what the lead auditor should do in determining the extent of work that the other firm should perform, the extent to which they should review the planning decisions, the nature, timing, and extent of work being done by the other firms to achieve what the objectives of the lead auditor are, or is it very prescriptive in terms of what documents the lead auditor might need in order to make their review of the work done, or exactly what type of report does the lead auditor want from the other auditor, either a full scope opinion or some sort of more restricted scope or limited scope work. And so the communication between and the interaction between lead auditor and other auditors could use more direction, and this project is largely about that. So again, the staff has been working busily on this project, and we hope to bring to the board in the first part of 2016 a proposal which would have a much greater level of involvement between the lead auditor and the work of other auditors in a multinational engagement. That could also be the case, let's just say, in a U.S. engagement where one firm, let's say a small firm located in Dallas, used another firm located in New England where that small firm might not have any offices, and if they're using their work under 543, this would replace that as well. So again, under AS10, auditors can work with other auditors if they are directly supervising that work. And so this would be, that could still exist, but this would replace AU 543, this particular project. The next project I'd like to talk about is the audit reporting model. As you know, the board proposed a new standard in 2013 for expanding the auditor's report to, among other things, include a discussion by the auditor of critical audit matters. A public hearing was held in 2014 regarding the possible changes to the auditor's report. Significant developments have occurred around the world while we've been working on our proposal. We've talked about this at some prior meetings, but already in the United Kingdom there's a couple of years' experience where there are requirements for expanded auditor reporting, where it's not exactly critical audit matters, but it's really the auditors talking about the risk of material misstatement that the auditor addressed and how the auditor responded to those risks of material misstatement, and to include that in the audit report. Remember, this is going from an audit report that's basically a single, one paragraph or two paragraph opinion that says we performed our audit in accordance with PCAOB standards, and in our opinion, the financial statements present fairly. Again, this was driven by a demand to say we need to have more information about exactly what the auditor did in the audit. And so the UK's response has been out there now for a couple of years. Quite a bit of academic research is now surrounding that. And also it's attracted a lot of investor attention at the same time. In fact, in the past year, there were awards given in the UK for the most innovative and most creative audit reports that really got into the most usefulness in terms of explaining what were those key risks of material misstatement that the auditor identified in that particular audit, and how did the auditor respond to that. So in general, very positive reaction in the United Kingdom to all that. At the same time, the IAASB, the International Standards Board, and Megan, if you want to comment on this in a second, you feel free to, has approved a standard already which would require disclosure of, among other things, in an expanded audit report, of key audit matters. And the key audit matters, again, aren't exactly the same as what's in the existing UK requirements, not exactly the same as what we proposed in critical audit matters, really, which we talked about the most complex subjective matters that the auditor faced, but very close, I think, in terms of the concept. And the IAASB approved that standard, and it's to go into effect for all listed companies that follow the international standards on auditing for year-end December 31, 2016. Megan, anything further on that? Or I'd be happy for you to... I summarized it okay? I got it thumb up, okay. So, what are we doing? We've spent a lot of time looking at academic research, looking at what's going on in the rest of the world, considering the comments that were made in the proposal. And our plan now is to, and in the comments we received at the public hearing, Our staff is drafting a reproposal of the auditor reporting standard for the board's consideration, hopefully in the first quarter of 2016. We believe that the reproposal will generally be similar along the lines of the 2013 proposal, but modified in some respects based on comments that we've received. I'd say the biggest modification, or certainly a modification, the source of critical audit matters, at least in my perspective, should come from matters that were communicated to the audit committee. That's the source of the CAMs, the KCAMs in the IAASB standard, and I think that's the proper source. The source in our proposal could have been from wider information, but I think one of the key changes we'll recommend is they would come from matters that were discussed with the audit committee. Hopefully, as I said, that proposal, the reproposal, will be out by March 31st, 2016. The 2013 proposal of ours also included another standard, a companion standard to the expanded auditor reporting, and that was around the auditor's responsibility with respect to other information included in the annual report. As we all know, and in fact at the lunch conversation I had, someone was talking about the proliferation of non-GAAP information included in 10Ks, et cetera. And so the other information standard that we proposed in 2013 was to address to some extent the proliferation of other information that is included along with the audited financial statements, and the importance that companies give to that other information, the prominence of it, and the importance that we're hearing from investors that they pay to that other information, non-GAAP measures, and other data around about the company. We were elevating in that proposed standard the current requirement, which was to read and consider that other information with respect to whether there's a material misstatement of that other information compared to the audited financial statements, and to more specifically say that the auditor should evaluate that other information as to whether there was a material inconsistency between the other information and the audited financial statements, and also whether there was a material misstatement of fact in that other information, and if so, there were steps to be taken by the auditor to address that, first with management, then with the audit committee, and then, if it wasn't corrected, to disclose the fact that they believed that existed. We received a lot of comment on that, a lot of debate about that issue, what evaluate actually meant. Did auditors have the ability to evaluate some of this information, and in the context that we meant? And so there was a lot more there for us to explore. So that therefore our 2016 reproposal of the auditor's reporting model is going to deal with the auditor's report and CAMs. It is not going to deal at this time with the auditor's responsibility with respect to other information. We're still working on that project. I think it's very pertinent to a discussion that the panel is going to have later on about proliferation of MD&A and whether a standard along that lines would be helpful with respect to raising investor confidence about that other information, but we need to do more work in that area before we come out with a reproposal in terms of what our views are and what we want to recommend to the board to do in that regard. The next item I want to talk about deals with the auditor's responsibility with respect to going concern. We've talked about this before. As you know, historically going concern responsibilities were, it's in 10A for the auditor to evaluate whether there is substantial doubt about a company's ability to continue as a going concern. And the auditing literature required the auditor to make such an evaluation as to whether there was substantial doubt about a company's ability to continue as a going concern, and include an explanatory paragraph if they concluded there was. As you know, the FASB adopted new disclosure requirements by management to take effect at December 31, 2016, although early adoption is permitted, which would require management to go through a process on a quarterly basis to evaluate whether there is a substantial doubt about their ability to continue as a going concern, and defined substantial doubt as when it was probable that a company would be unable to pay their debts as they fall due in the next 12 months. Our existing auditing standard didn't have a definition of substantial doubt, and it was qualitative in nature, the evaluation. So as we said before, our standard-setting project on this is to consider amendments to the PCAOB standards in light of the changes to GAAP and to potentially improve the effectiveness of auditor going concern reporting. Our research indicates information on both sides of this. In many cases, going concern reports, and nothing wrong with this, but going concern reports are given and companies continue to exist for many, many years and maybe go back into business as normal. On the other hand, in many cases, no going concern warning is given and companies go into bankruptcy. And so the staff's been doing a significant amount of research around going concern reporting to facilitate a proper economic analysis. So they've been reviewing extensive research on going concern, looking at published data on auditor going concern reporting compared to business failures, and researching specific cases where companies failed without getting prior going concern warnings. We're also performing outreach to better understand investor needs and expectations regarding auditor going concern reporting to assess current audit practices. So we plan to issue a consultation paper early next year after this extensive research to get views from auditors, preparers, investors, and others as to what steps the PCAOB should take with respect to amending or addressing our current auditing standard and the current inconsistency that exists between our auditing standard and the GAAP disclosures that are now required by the FASB. The next item I'd like to talk about is actually two items sort of together, because we've been talking about them together at this Standing Advisory Group for some time, and they pertain to the auditing, accounting estimates, and fair value measures, and the use of specialists, items 6 and 7 on the standard setting agenda. As you may recall, both of these items have been the subject of staff consultation papers over the past year or so, and we received good input from commenters on those staff consultation papers and received good input at this Standing Advisory Group when we discussed the staff consultation papers with the SAG. And we've heard a lot of good comments from you on all of this. And you're going to hear tomorrow on the results of the staff consultation paper on specialists, what we heard in terms of comments, and Greg Scaife and his team will present a summary of the themes that we've heard about that. Since the last meeting, we've been evaluating those comments and looking at some paths forward with respect to specialists, and we'll be laying out some of that with you tomorrow and seeking your views on a way forward on certain aspects with respect to specialists. Before I turn to accounting estimates, I see Tom Stelling's card's up. Is there something I've said so far you want to touch on?
Yeah, just one issue of clarification about going concern. From previous meetings, it's been my understanding that the law requires going concern reporting by auditors. But I'm just wondering that if after your outreach, to better understand investors' needs, and you examine the empirical literature that casts substantial doubt on the utility of going concern reporting by auditors, what would you do if all of your outreach proved to be negative, that none of this was going to benefit investors, but the law requires, nonetheless, that the going concern, that the auditors evaluate whether or not there's substantial doubt to exist as a going concern?
Well, certainly I don't want to prejudge what the research and outreach is going to show, but 10A does require the auditor to evaluate whether there's substantial doubt about the company's ability to continue as a going concern. GAAP requires that GAAP now requires that management make an evaluation as to whether there's substantial doubt. And so by definition, auditors will have to report on whether there's substantial doubt if management discloses that in the financial statements. And so there'll be reporting by auditors whether they agree with that disclosure, or if they didn't agree with the non-disclosure, auditors would have to point that out, that management evaluated substantial doubt, determined there was none, and if the auditor believed there was some, I presume the auditor would have to say the financial statements aren't presented fairly. So, but I don't want to prejudge what we're going to do on this, but I presume that there will be some type of auditor reporting going forward on this at a minimum. So turning to the project on accounting estimates and fair value measures, again, by way of view, we've had this consultation paper and a discussion at the SAG meeting. And the SAG discussion focused largely around some of the key matters that we're addressing and were really emphasized by many of you to address in the discussions we've had about this. And that was to really emphasize in a standard, or how could we emphasize in a standard, the need for professional skepticism in auditing estimates and fair value measures. Complex estimates and complex fair value measures require the use of professional skepticism by auditors and not be anchored to an amount that management has determined and try to audit just around that amount, but to be skeptical and consider what is the right amount that should be reported and consider alternative evidence other than what's supporting management's determination of the estimate or fair value measure, but make sure evidence that doesn't corroborate is considered as well in determining the fair value of the financial statements and the appropriate estimate and fair value measure. Additionally, to address the use of third parties in determination of estimates, whether they're actuarial reserves or oil in the ground or fair value measures of level 2 securities. Third parties, either specialists or pricing services, are heavily involved, and that our standards should consider the use of third parties and make sure that that's appropriately addressed in the standard. And also, as we've discussed with you, the standards should more specifically address measurement uncertainty and the auditor's responsibility, especially in situations where measurement uncertainty can be so wide for an estimate or fair value measure that it could be wider than materiality, for instance. Auditors can't reduce measurement uncertainty, but what are their responsibilities when a wide degree of measurement uncertainty exists? So these are some of the matters that we've been focusing on in our work to develop an improved standard on auditing and accounting estimates. In addition, commenters broadly have said, and across the board have said to us, that the two projects of auditing, accounting estimates, and fair value measures and the use of specialists have so much in common and interplay and so much interaction between each other that anything we do in this regard should be put out for comment at the same time, so that commenters could consider our proposals with respect to auditing estimates and fair value measures and consider our thoughts about use of pricing services and use of specialists at the same time and consider those interactions. And so we've been working to get hard to make sure that these projects now are coordinated, the project teams are working together, and our discussions with the board will be about these two projects moving along at the same time, and the interaction of estimates and fair values and the use of third parties. Any comments further? Barbara, who leads this project on estimates and fair value?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, again, I'm certainly thankful for the SAG input that we got last October and again in June. But we're also certainly very interested of what, if anything, comes out of the emerging issue discussion later today that may be relevant to this project, whether it's forward-looking assumptions. I hope that your groups do get to that topic at some point in time. I'll put that little request in now. Or if maybe the use of data analytics has further implications for us to think about.
Joan Amble.
Yeah, my impression is this project's been contemplated for a while, and I was just curious, are there any barriers or hurdles that you see that we should be aware of and maybe provide some comments on, if that's helpful? And I think that would relate to this and some of the other projects as well, if any of them have been on for more than a couple of years.
I think the consultation papers were the key element to advance these projects forward, so especially with respect to specialists and fair value estimate and fair value measures and estimates. Those consultation papers were published within the past 18 months to 12 months. And those papers raised the key challenges that these projects have opposed to us, and also addressed what is another challenge in our regard, to make sure that there is a need for additional rulemaking. Simply the fact that there's a lot of audit deficiencies with respect to auditing fair value measures or estimates doesn't support a need to change the auditing standards, just improve audit quality through inspections or through firms' own quality controls. And so those papers explored ways in which we could not only change the standards, but explored, is there a need for additional standard setting in this area, and what is the need for additional standard setting to support our economic analysis to proceed with the projects, and also for enable us to do an appropriate cost-benefit analysis for anything that we do to make sure that we're proposing standards where we think there's an appropriate equation between the benefits to be achieved and costs that might be attained. So these projects, certainly our requirements around economic analysis were helped by the consultation paper and the comments we got, as well as the discussion we had with the SAG. So thanks.
Do we feel at this point that we have a resolution to those issues so that we might see this being sped along a little bit more quickly at this point?
We think we've gotten a lot more information with respect to some of the key issues that were challenges in this standard with respect to pricing services, third-party services, measurement uncertainty, and things like that, as well as we laid out what we thought the need for this project was in the consultation papers. We got comments back, and in general the comments supported the need for changing our standards in this area, and so we think we do have the information to move forward, and our plan would be for proposals of these two standards on fair value measures and use of specialists in mid-2016. I think the standard setting agenda indicates by about June 30th, 2016. Any other questions? So the next project on the agenda, which isn't actively being worked on right now, once we move a couple of these other projects, we expect to get back to it. It's a very high priority project. We've had some resource constraints in dealing with it, and that deals with the quality control standards. I'd say given the number of deficiencies that were commented upon earlier this morning in some of the inspection reports, I think standards on improving quality controls would be very useful. The project on root cause analysis of the deficiencies is a useful companion project, and we're working together with inspections closely as we think about what we might do on the quality control project. Once again, our standard setting agenda indicates that we'll issue a consultation paper as the next step, again because of the fact to seek information from a variety of parties about the need to improve the quality control standards and about how we might go about improving the quality control standards before we move to a proposal in that regard. So we're doing a lot of research in this area, coordinating our work closely with inspections, and expect to move on this, start to move this forward in 2016, although we won't see a concept release, I don't think, until at the very end of 2016 at the earliest. Keith, do you want to comment on this a little further?
Yeah, as Marty said, this is a pretty significant project in terms of both its importance, but also the scope and the magnitude of the project. So we still have a number of items we need to think about and to talk about and work on in terms of establishing a good understanding of the baseline in practice, understanding the key drivers of audit quality and how that might be best informed into quality control standards. So we still have a good bit of work ahead of us in terms of moving that forward, but currently we are still, although our resources are few, we are still spending a fair amount of time trying to understand what insights we gain through our root cause initiative, through our inspections program, and trying to figure out things that we can learn from that in terms of thinking about both understanding what the state of current practice as well as things that we might be able to do with the standards to improve audit quality.
Thanks, Keith. And Megan Seitzman, I see your card is up.
Thanks, Marty. I thought maybe this would just be a good time just to interject and talk a little bit about some of the IAASB's plans with respect to the topic of quality control. Really informational, but I also think that some of the activities may be, may provide some good information that would be helpful kind of collectively to both the IAASB and the PCAOB in moving forward on this topic. So the IAASB has quality control as one of its key topics on its work plan for this year and next year, and has been doing a lot of preliminary work to really try to frame up some of the issues, thinking about things like root cause analysis, monitoring, remediation, and really having that built more into firms' systems of quality control. So the IAASB is actually working on a combined a discussion paper, essentially, but it will combine the topics of quality control as well as some of the other things that they're working on into a big invitation for comment, which is planned to go out in December. And that's going to pose some questions around quality control about how to really improve the standards, how to think about how to make them more scalable, more risk-based, thinking about using more of a quality management approach to how quality should be managed and achieved. So that's going to have a fairly long comment period, probably about a 5-month period. So it just seems like, I think, some of the comments that we might receive to that paper, as well as some of the outreach and the information gathering that's going to go on, could be at a very timely stage. It sounds like for some of the PCAOB's activities as well. And obviously, to the extent we can kind of keep the collective body of information moving the projects forward together, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Megan. Very, very helpful. And a question some may have is, well, yeah, that was a really good point Megan made, the fact that the IAASB is working on a project. Are you coordinating and talking to each other about these projects? So a couple of things. First, just as the IAASB sits on our Standing Advisory Group, I sit on the IAASB's Consultative Advisory Group, CAG, and stay in touch with what they're doing and close to all of their projects. Separately, we meet with the teams that are working on these projects. We've met on many occasions on the audit reporting model with Dan Montgomery, who led that project, and his team, and comparing thoughts and ideas on proceeding on the audit reporting model. And recently we just had a meeting with some of the IAASB folks on your fair value project, which we're working on as well. So the answer to a question that might have come to your mind of, gee, do you guys talk to each other about these standard-setting matters that are of common interest? The answer is yes. And it's that kind of conversation and recommendation that you just made is very valuable, and we do try to benefit from that. So thanks. Other questions, comments? The last thing I want to mention is an initiative to organize PCAOB guidance. So we've just completed the project to reorganize PCAOB standards, and obviously I talked about that this morning. That reorganization is now up on our website, and we have reorganized standards in a much more logical fashion, much more user-friendly, both for auditors, academics, and other bodies to use. The only thing is everybody has to get used to the new numbering, sort of like people had to get used to, Larry, when they went from FAS 157 to new ASU numbers. Took a little bit of time to get used to the numbering. So we have a similar initiative underway to organize not our standards, but our guidance that exists. Practice alerts, for instance, or there's even guidance that exists in a lot of the board releases, and we're looking at that as well. So it's come up at discussion here at the SAG meetings a number of times about, do you have guidance on your website? Do you keep it up to date? Could you organize it maybe in a more useful way? So we have the ability now to turn our attention to that, and to do that, we've had some preliminary initiated discussions with the board and started to research various approaches to the organization of our guidance. And we expect to advance this project forward as well in 2016. So you'll be hearing more about this at upcoming SAG meetings. So with that completes my update of activities on standard setting. I'm happy to take any further questions. We have a couple more minutes, or we could turn to the next agenda item. So David.
Could I say how pleased I am that you're paying so much attention to the international standards. I was delighted to see 2 of the standards in the papers for this meeting, and I think it's great that it's not a clean sheet of paper and you are cooperating in the way you do. This country's always been a leader in, well, apart from accounting standards, of course, that was when that leadership's elsewhere, but as far as this is concerned and moving forward, it's always been very much to the fore, and people have copied, what you've done. And there's just a sadness that in the audit report and the auditor's name, you couldn't do what the rest of the world's doing. And I'm not a lawyer, but I said before, I don't understand how showing an auditor's name in a different document makes much difference from actually putting it in the audit report. It seems a great shame this country is so tied down with lawyers. It's of the lawyers, by the lawyers, for the lawyers. And I've said before, if they drafted the Independence Declaration, you'd still be swearing allegiance to the Queen, and you'd be defining happiness. It's just, I just don't understand why the lawyers have got such a cold hand on everything you do. You really, one of these days, this country's got to tell them, go jump in the lake.
Any of the lawyers want to respond to that?
I better go to the airport before I make sued here.
Well, I did file a submission, but it was more of an apology, if I may say that, on this to try to map out the legal boundaries here. And we may just have a short answer here that what divides us is not a great ocean, but what we call in this country the American rule. You shouldn't be surprised about that. And it facilitates litigation at a scale we don't find any other place on the globe. And that means that everybody pays their own litigation costs. And that creates a lot of incentives that is the caboose that drives the engine that you and I would prefer to have happen. And then if that isn't enough, we've, unlike what's happened in your country, we've fragmented our legal standards as we've enacted a series of statutes, and then our courts have been taken advantage of the common law system and created rights that Congress perhaps never really envisioned. And I speak as one who thinks that's a great innovation, but I'm one of 1,000 in that regard. 999 against it, I'm one for it. And so when you put all that together, I think that it is a very different topography that we have here, and then that drives it. I mean, in my own comment letter, I did try to say that I think the fears are in some areas exist, but in many areas largely exaggerated and stretched. But because our courts are not perfectly predictable, the future is uncertain, and we're in a conservative group, not politically, but in terms of how we judge our behavior. And so I think people vibrate to wanting to have something more certain, which in this case pushes some of these standards around, where in your country we would have reached, if we had your legal standard, we would reach from a different result. That's my take on things.
Sir David, I think this is England's fault. You sent us, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, and we've all turned into lawyers.
Yeah, we sent too many lawyers, clearly.
All right, well, thank you very much for those comments, and that wraps up our standard setting update. So we'll now turn to the next item on our agenda, and that is our discussion of emerging issues that could affect audits, auditors, or the PCAOB. So our panel, consisting of Joan Amble, Mike Gallagher, Joyce Joseph, Sandy Peters, and Phil Santorelli, were nice enough to contribute their time to consider emerging issues, develop the slides, and to chair the discussion both here, in which they will present each of the emerging issues, actually the 6 primary issues in their slides, one at a time. They'll take a few minutes to talk about the emerging issue, and then we'll have a few minutes on the floor for comment. Remember, we are going to go into breakout where we can explore these issues in greater detail. This public session should also give enough time, I believe, that if other SAG members think that there are other issues that are emerging that aren't included in these 10 that are important for us to consider, to discuss, and at the breakout session, and important for the PCAOB to be aware of, please make sure you bring those matters up. In the breakout sessions, We are going to explore in each session 2 individual of the 6 primary matters, but hopefully there'll be enough time in the breakout session to talk as well about matters beyond those 2 issues and explore other emerging issues that you think are important that were raised either by the panel or other issues that you think are not raised. And tomorrow there'll be reports back from the 3 breakout rooms, so everybody will get a view of what was discussed on the primary issues as well as other issues that may have come up. And again, remember, the importance of this discussion is it's about these issues and how they impact audits or auditors or the PCAOB. And that's really important in terms of your comments. So with that, let me turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. We'll jump right in. The first item that we teed up is whistleblower. Okay, and so when we thought about topics that we would talk about today, the screen we used are things that are, emerging issues, things that are new or things that may have been around for a while, but there's a new flavor to it, and whistleblower would definitely fall into that category. Whistleblower has been around for a long time, but there was a significant event that occurred, with Dodd-Frank and the new whistleblower rules that established some pretty significant financial incentive for whistleblowers, which is good, is that you'll identify, bad actions. Whistleblowers can be a very effective tool to identify bad actions and bad actors, so on the positive side. It clearly has driven a lot of allegations around illegal acts, which has driven a lot of investigations. And when an auditor becomes aware of a potential illegal act, the auditor has a responsibility under the securities law to make sure that it's been appropriately dealt with. And what does that mean, appropriately dealt with? It really is a span of potential activities, because the allegation of the illegal act could span from anything to an expense report violation in an immaterial part of the company's operation at a low level of management on one end. On the other end, it could be an allegation that the CEO or other members of senior management are manipulating earnings. And they require a very, very different response. On the one hand, an investigation of an expense report can probably be dealt with by internal audit. Internally, and as long as they're separated from the level that's being investigated. And they can credibly do that investigation and be done with it. And by the way, that happens quite frequently. On the other end of that barbell, if you have an allegation, a credible allegation, that a senior member of management is manipulating the financial statements, that's a very different issue in terms of the adequacy of the scope of the investigation, the independence of the investigation, and the scope. And the auditor has to be involved every step of the way in that, because ultimately the auditor we have our own responsibilities with respect to making sure appropriate actions have been taken by the audit committee and management to properly run the potential illegal act to ground. And if it's not, then we have obligations, separate reporting obligations in the worst case. So the issue that comes to bear is that, as more of these investigations are happening, there's a number of issues that auditors need to deal with, particularly around the scope and scale of the investigation, the adequacy of the investigation, and making sure the appropriate balance is achieved. And that's not always a black and white issue. And some investors may say, well, by all means, you ought to drive every investigation to the nth degree. We have to know exactly what happened. It needs to be a very independent investigation. But with that comes not only the cost of the investigation, but some of these investigations potentially have a bearing on whether the financial statements that are currently being reported on, 10Qs that are just about to be filed or 10Ks that are about to be filed, whether they can credibly be filed, or whether a company has to, in effect, go dark for a period and not have financial statements on file. So I think it's in everybody's interest to do a thorough investigation, and appropriately thorough investigation, relative to what the allegation was, but do it as quickly as possible, recognizing that there's a need to have information to the public, disclosure about not only the investigation but the financial results of the company that people can stand behind. The other challenge here is that the market, given the fact that whistleblower activity is up, investigations are up, you're finding more and more law firms that don't have as much experience with these sorts of investigations are jumping into the act. And the challenge there, and believe me, I get it. I understand how capitalism works, and I'm a capitalist, and people are going to run to that revenue opportunity. However, The challenge that auditors face very often is a law firm saying that, hey, I can do this investigation, even though, yes, it involves senior management, and I've been this company's attorney, and they pay me $10 million a year. Well, that perception is just never going to work, no matter if that attorney and if that law firm may be a wonderful law firm and they may do a great investigation, but it's not going to hold up optically. And so very often we have these intramurals with not only the company, but counsel that is less experienced in doing these investigations. So as you have more of them, I think this will become a greater and greater issue in terms of a better general understanding of what's appropriate under various circumstances, and then you can't clearly do a cookie cutter here. Circumstances are unique. Judgment is definitely required. But right now, there's very little out there in terms of what is appropriate to do under various circumstances, and so we thought it was worth having a dialogue today over this issue, given the fact that, at least from a volume standpoint, it's an emerging issue. And maybe Joan can talk about it from an audit committee perspective.
Yes, as Mike mentioned, clearly this is something the independent auditors have to be addressing so that they can issue a clean opinion. There is, however, a very substantial role for the audit committee in a number of these circumstances. He described two different circumstances you can have under Section 10A. One can be something that's a T&L expense item that relates to a more junior person. If it's a very serious situation, however, that relates to a senior executive, and, for example, if that allegation goes directly to the audit committee, which that can happen, the question is, does the audit committee understand what their role is? Because how they manage this is very critical to whether or not the external auditor can accept the results of that study. And I'll just mention a couple things that we may want to talk about. The first is, do you have an escalation policy? Does the audit committee chair know what to do if they get the call? Number one. Number two, Mike had mentioned there are certain circumstances, the latter I just described would be one where the audit committee most likely would have to be the one to engage the firm. Do you have a firm at the ready? Do you know who to call? And then number three is, how do you provide the appropriate communication to management and to your external auditors? All of those are very important things. The other, which can actually spiral out of control, and we've probably seen more of these out of control than maybe properly controlled if there's not a proper process set up in place with education, is maintaining an appropriate scope. And if the scope gets out of bounds, it can actually be very harmful. Not just from a cost perspective. Costs go up, but that's not the issue. The issue is it gets into and it dilutes your efforts, and it really gets into areas that it really shouldn't. So really knowing how to manage that process, because you own the process even if you brought in outside counsel. So those are just some things to think about.
Great. So, Marty, I think what we were hoping to do at the end of each of the 6 issues is solicit some feedback from the rest of the SAG, and specifically not try to resolve the issue in the brief amount of time that we have, but tee up issues that we could deal with in the breakouts, which is really where the heavy lifting is going to occur. So, Marty, I'm not sure whether you want to control the floor or whether you want to have us do it. Okay. 10 car. I see Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. In this area, I guess I would say it used to be that and let's deal at your end of the barbell where it's a more significant allegation, that in essence what was happening is there was an investigation being performed, and we as auditors often felt, or maybe normally felt, that the investigation needed to be complete, and we needed to understand the results, to understand our continued association and ability to report. I now see a trend, though, that investigations at times, and especially when they're in whistleblower context where you've got a third party interested and maybe continuing a dialogue, that really investigations sometimes are almost never complete. A lot's done. There's findings or lack of findings from what was done to date, but maybe a lack of comfort by an audit committee or an investigator to say, okay, well, we're just going to say that's enough and we're not going to pick up our pencil again. And I don't know if you've talked at all about that concept about the degree of comfort one needs to move forward versus the need to have it 100% complete.
Yeah, and I think that's a great issue that we'll tee up, for the breakout. That'll be one of the questions that we can tee up.
The other thing I would add to that, because I think it's a very good point, is let's say you feel that the investigation is complete, the audit committee and the firm has to determine that is actually just the easy part of the job. The hard part of the job is now that you have the recommendations, there's a responsibility to ensure that they've been not only put in place, processes and procedures to put in place, but that they are effective. And so that's another thing that you have to think about, because that's probably the hardest part and the most time-consuming potentially as well, and that's a role that we'd have to talk about.
Great. It's a great issue. Anybody else?
As an emerging issue, it's intriguing to me to look at the potential of the independent auditor staff or the legal counsel staff to be a whistleblower or to profit or benefit from the whistleblower statutes. I think there's been some development recently in the New York rules of ethics on this that will be interesting to study. There are attempts to limit the ability of internal employees of the company to be whistleblowers through bylaws or other devices that have gotten some judicial attention. I'll be very interested to see what SAG members think about any of that.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Sri?
And also what we're to do about it, to go back to Marty's question, is going to be something that will be interesting to hear.
Over the last few months, I've developed a presentation on which I'm currently writing a paper, and the title is Managing Risk at the Speed of Change. And one of the things that I'm concluding is that whether it's whistleblowers or anything that's unexpected but is morphing very rapidly, and companies need to respond. Otherwise, the whole thing might get out of control. And cybersecurity is another example in that area, is that companies need to start thinking not just about the escalation protocol that Joan talked about, but really having teams of first responders, in terms of dealing with such crises when they come up. So it's literally these people are waiting for things to happen, but they know what to do so that there are no missteps in terms of the response that would make it even worse.
Great. Thank you, Sri. That's a great issue. Other input?
You have Brian Phelan and Brian Croto.
Great. Brian Croto?
Thanks. While we're on this topic, I just thought I would mention the Commission has actually recently spoken in this space somewhat. Very recently there was an enforcement case relative to an annually inspected firm where an engagement partner, engagement quality reviewer, national office partner, and a risk management partner were barred from appearing and practicing before the SEC based upon not following through on the need for an investigation to be done and following up on 10 Cap A responsibilities. And so for those who haven't seen that, I think it's worth, in this context, taking a read through that. It's informative and something that gets the Commission's attention. Now, I appreciate that may have a set of facts that might be different than the kinds of things you're getting at in the more typical things we see on a day-to-day basis, but in this space, but certainly, I think, informative and a good reminder for auditors.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Brian?
Thanks. As having headed up large internal audit functions in a couple public companies, the escalation process and having that predefined with the audit committee is key. We often had in case of fire, break glass type of setup where the audit committee had a legal firm that was not conflicted with us, a public accounting firm that was not conflicted with us. So at the escalation point, if they chose to make the call, they could make the call on what they needed to do, and they didn't have to think about it at the time when something came up. The other piece is, how does the compliance organization factor into the reporting process? Sometimes the legal group may work on things, doesn't necessarily get shared on the internal audit side, making sure that everybody understands the ground rules, that things need to flow up to the audit committee, and a lot of times predefining some of the criteria that you need to, if it looks like this, smells like this, feels like this is where you go. And the clearer that the ground rules are, the less likely that somebody's going to wind up working on something off in some corner of the world and it doesn't get to the right place in time.
That's great. We have one more. Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Maria.
Thanks. I was just really pleased to see this on the agenda, discussion, because it's such an important area. When we meet with companies, such as in China, we talk about having a whistleblower program and how it's one of the best ways to uncover fraud, for them to stay on top of it, and to have it audited. We really enforce that it be audited. So I think it's a great area to have some structure around the responsibilities, because there is a lot that's uncovered by the whistleblowers. So I would think the auditors would want to be on top of it anyway.
Absolutely. Thanks. Marty, I know we're kind of a little bit pressed. Maybe one more, and then we've got about an hour, and we've got 5 other topics. So we got to.
It's real quick. I would just suggest that given the FCPA and other control environments, you also want to look at foreign corresponding firms and component audits as part of this. That's it.
Thank you. Okay. We'll move on to economic development.
So as Mike said, when we were considering things that affect the audit process, several economic issues came up, given we're living in, I guess, the era of extreme economic policy. Some of it, we've listed 2 of them here, falling oil prices and low interest rates. Specifically within falling oil prices, the issue is really just the decline and the volatility over the last year, and the impact that it may have on financial statements and the audit process. And as it relates to low interest rates, while we hear that maybe interest rates will go up in December in the United States, we also simultaneously hear that in other parts of the world, for example Europe, they're going to continue easy monetary policy. So the question is, what is the effect of these issues on the financial statements, and I guess, and the audit process? The issue we see isn't necessarily as much emerging as emergent, and the question is really, what are all of the different places where this shows up in the financial statements and through the audit process? So our ask as a part of the breakout session is for the various diverse members of this committee or group to consider those impacts on audit risk, on particular financial statement balances or estimates, but not necessarily as we've listed here, or not just only as we've listed here, some first-order effects on particular financial statement captions, but possibly also the impact that these have on audit teams, and have they considered the impact that these have on the general business environment that the company is working in, management's response to that general business environment, the pressures that it may place on them and on the risk assessment. And also second-order economic effects. So, for example, low interest rates, its cousin is foreign currency, and the relative impacts of interest rates, say, in the U.S. versus Europe, and what that has, as we hear as investors, all about the strong dollar and its impact on business results. And what are, for example, just foreign currency translations, and what are real cash impacts. So our ask is to consider not just these particular direct items, but their second, possibly third-order effects and their impacts on the companies, or the business, the companies, the auditors, and the audits. And we thought that this diverse group of people could provide some good insight into those considerations. So I'll open it up to any comments.
Philip Johnson.
Thank you, Marty. This obviously is important. I think that I'm not going to be in that session, but I think commodity prices on the whole should be considered here, because that's where the big impact is. and also the global economic situation is impacting on many businesses. And in the UK, in the last month, we've had notification of 2 steel mills closing because of concern over dumping of subsidized steel from other jurisdictions, and also automotive tire facilities being closed, big plants being closed because of the general economic environment. So it's absolutely pertinent, but I think it is much wider than just oil prices. It is commodity prices in general, as well as the impact of interest rates on, quite rightly, currency as well as
and both the low interest rate environment and the low commodity prices tell us something about deflation, right?
Yeah.
The impact of deflation.
I think, is that Rick Murray's card?
Thanks. Sandy, the implications for commercial risk are clear and obviously very important, but do you see a separate channel of implications for audit risk? Commercial risk being that things won't turn out as anticipated, audit risk being essentially that the report will prove to have been inappropriate in the circumstances.
Well, I guess I see it in a couple ways. I think that certainly as you audit, there are a lot of inherently forward-looking assumptions in estimates of goodwill or goodwill impairment tests, in disclosure of risk factors, in use of discount rates. I mean, for example, in insurance, right now, I mean, deflation is the death spiral of insurance. And the consequence is significant in the consequence of the discounting to liabilities, but it's also having behavioral impacts on the risk that management's willing to take on the asset side. So from, the thing that I guess that from an investor perspective, as we think about the financial statements, we think, do auditors understand these commercial issues, and do they understand their impact and all the different ways that they seep into the financial statements, and seeping into the financial statements not just in balances but in the behavior of management and the decisions that they're taking, i.e., let's buy back shares, let's not make investments, as one example. Is there a true understanding amongst each audit team of the economic developments which are important to them, and how they run through the tone from all the way from the tone to the top to the fair value of a particular asset?
Philip, just to your comment that you're not going to be in that session, there are 2 primary topics in each session. I think they're clearly the focus of the session, but hopefully in each session, to the extent somebody believes there's other important matters that they want to discuss, that were discussed here, or even other matters, hopefully there's enough time, and we've allocated enough time for that to happen in the sessions. David Kane? Yes.
Yeah, Marty, thanks. I think this is actually a really good list and a really good topic. A couple other considerations here is also thinking about M&A. I mean, so a lot more takeover targets right now, particularly when we start thinking about one-time transactions and using ASC 820 market participant assumptions, and probably taking a step back as well, thinking about all the ICFR implications. So with declining earnings also mean potentially declining materiality and changing scopes. So what does that mean in terms of the ICFR environment when we start thinking about precision and review controls? So there's some knock-on effects there as well.
Good points. Steve Harris.
Mike or Sandy, do you see any need for an audit alert dealing with either of these 2 issues on the part of the PCAOB?
Well, I've seen 1 or 2 things from some of the firms published, but I do think from the PCAOB it would be a useful exercise in all the considerations that are necessary. I don't know.
Yeah, no, Sandy, Sandy's right. The firms, Steve, have done it, and some of the stuff, interest rates have been low for a little while now, and oil is more recent, but not, it's certainly been around for the last probably 5-6 months for sure in a significant way. And we are doing this as a firm, but probably not a bad idea to have something as a profession as well, that these are issues. Economic events do have reporting consequences and auditing consequences for sure. So I certainly wouldn't be against it.
Guy Jubb and Jeremy Pearl.
To follow through from Sandy's comments, mine's more a comment than a question. It is in relation to audit consequences of falling oil prices. We observed last year at the year end when oil prices had fallen, but it was a relatively recent phenomenon, that there was quite a variation in terms of the oil price assumptions made by management. And there is a bias, as I think we would all acknowledge, for a bias towards optimism sometimes on the time horizons for when oil prices will recover. And as I've read in the press in the last few weeks, with the Saudis continuing to generate oil for a long time, I think it is important for users of financial statements that auditors apply skepticism not only in relation to the shorter-term assumptions, but also in relation to the medium-term assumptions that management may use in reaching some of the figures that go into the financial statement. So I wanted to emphasize that medium-term degree of skepticism that users would expect auditors to apply to management estimates in that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think that I don't think anybody thought interest rates, for example, were going to be as low for as long as they have been. And understanding what management's underlying assumptions are for the short term, the medium term, and, in discounting some liabilities, the long term, is very important in understanding what happened year to year and what their change in perspective was.
And I think within that, audit committees, as a line of defense, are only half a line of defense sometimes in this, because they too will probably be informed by some of management's bias as well. So this is why auditors have to be particularly strong.
Jeremy?
Thanks. I think this is a great topic too. I think about it more less in terms of specific issues and more in terms of these economic developments. Something is always in play. If we had this conversation a few years ago, it might have been high oil prices and the effect on a different subset of companies. And the paradigm might be to think about, whatever the big economic developments that are happening today, if they can be identified, there are probably sweeping differences to certain subsets of companies and estimates that would be fundamentally changed. So, thinking about how to incorporate that in the current process, whatever the issues are at that time, would be a good idea.
Agreed.
It's time for one more card on this one, and then we'll move to the next topic. I saw Richard Breeden's card up.
Thanks. Obviously, there's nothing more important to virtually any reporting company than economic developments in the markets it operates in. I personally can't think of anything less relevant than having my auditors speculating about whether oil prices are going to go up or down. I think that would be I suspect that wasn't the intent here, but and interest rates have been at zero since 2008, and central banks around the world have kept them that way, and you can watch CNBC all day long, and they, 3/4 of the day is about, is the Fed going to raise or is it not? So I think there is a role on some of this stuff, to me, backward-looking rather than forward-looking. If the change in oil prices for a company and that somehow connected to that has caused hedges to become large liabilities, has caused a company's capital structure to become highly risky, has caused them to go from modest leverage to enormous leverage. If there's something significant that goes to the impairment of assets or a change in the magnitude of certain types of liabilities, fine. I think that there could be areas where the auditors can play an important role, but remembering that we do have those folks out there called securities analysts, not that they always do a perfect job, and we do have rating agencies, and we do have all the investors in the world who are asking these very questions. I think one risks dilution of focus on the part of auditors if you have them spending too much time worried about oil prices and not enough time worrying about how accurately are this company's results and its balance sheet presented as of today or as of a reporting date to investors.
I would agree with you to some degree in that, looking backward is important, but there's so many assumptions that are included in the financial statements today. So I don't think we're talking about speculating on oil prices, but understanding what management's assumptions were in their disclosure of reserves, and is that consistently applied throughout their analysis of not just the disclosure, but their impairment analysis and their forecasts. I think understanding that management is consistent, or what management's view, or how they've incorporated those assumptions into the estimates which become part of the financial statements is really what we're trying to get at. Certainly, securities analysts they're going to ask what are your assumptions and how have they been incorporated, and try and get management to talk about how they've reconciled them. But in saying that when there are forward-looking estimates included in the financial statements, that's a pretty important thing for the auditor to understand as well.
Yeah, and they should hopefully listen to the quarterly earnings calls carefully, and if they hear something that is divergent from reality as they assess it, that's one thing. But I think this is, I'm not sure how you translate. Again, there are things like the question of pension plans and the valuations, and whether for a persistent period of time interest rates are below assumptions which would change the present value of liabilities. I mean, that I can see the applicability, but having some kind of if it were vague, charter to auditors to be worried about economic developments and how that might impact the value of shares of Shake Shack or any of 17,000 other issuers, I think would risk considerable expense, considerable dilution of focus, and I'm not sure would contribute much in the end of the day.
Yeah, maybe I can just, in terms of, I think your point's very well taken, Richard, and as the great philosopher Clint Eastwood said, a man's got to know his limitations. And so does the auditing profession. We don't have a crystal ball and we don't know. But what we can do is make sure that there's a reasonable basis for the assumptions that underlie material accounts, and that the disclosures are there. For example, if you've got something that's teetering on impairment and it's okay, but if something doesn't go perfectly, it's going to go the other way quickly in a big way, making sure those sorts of disclosures. I think that's the heart of what we were trying to get at.
Agreed, and I think also listening to not just analyst calls, because that's after the financial statements are done, but investor outlooks that come out this time of year, for example, on what the forward earnings estimates are and what assumptions management has made, and if those actually show up in the estimates that are being made in the financial statements is, I think, something that auditors don't always do. And I think that's an important thing for some do, some don't, but I think it's an important way to understand what management's thinking and whether that rolls into the financial statements.
I'm way over my time for the last comment, so I apologize.
I think we're going to have a great breakout session on this one. John,
I just wanted to try to square the circle for the breakout. And I think you've done yourself a disservice by citing falling oil prices and low interest rates. Because I think, as Jeremy said, 5 years ago it would have been high interest rates. The issue to me that affects auditors is you've had a financialization of companies. There's more hedging contracts. The nature of the balance sheet is more complicated. Some of those balance sheet instruments are more volatile in response to economic situations, and at the same time you have more volatile global economic markets. So I think that if you looked at it in terms of how exposed to various financial risks is the capital structure of the company and the reserves crossed with an increased volatile market base, you actually get to what auditors should be looking at in terms of impairment and things, rather than our oil price is going to stay high or low, our interest rate is going to go up, et cetera.
Great. Okay.
Next topic.
Next topic is use of data and data auditing. So technology clearly has changed and will continue to change, probably at a more rapid rate over the next few years, how audits are executed on the ground. You know, companies have invested enormously in enterprise-wide software that has the ability to be very well controlled, provide a lot of information, and therefore subject to auditing through use of technology. The firms have made a substantial investment in technology, and just to put a little a color in terms of what I mean there, everything from what I'd say risk assessment tools through visualization. So for example, putting at an auditor's fingertips the ability to have a database, the company's data in front of him or her, and be able to manipulate it and look for that needle in the haystack. So whether it's looking for unusual journal entries where one side is revenue and the other side is not accounts receivable. Okay, and to the extent unusual entries have been identified with respect to an individual, what other entries did that individual make? What entries were made just before the earnings release? Risk factors that would be very helpful in using technology to help identify those risk factors to, again, identify that needle in a haystack more effectively than a very broad, large sample that samples the entire population. That's one part of it. Another part of data auditing and the use of technology goes more deeply into actually executing the audit procedures. So something as simple as the three-way match when a manufacturer sells a product, and matching off the invoice with the purchase order and the shipping document, having that done automatically through the system. And there's much more, as you go through different variations of how to use technology, how to look at data and the like, that provide enormous potential. Just think about, again, I'll go back to sampling, where you're looking at, pick your sample size, even if it's 1,000 items, it's broadly across, hundreds of thousands of items. Potentially, in a fraction of the time, technology can do that three-way match for 100% of the population in a fraction of the time it takes to do it manually. This does present issues in terms of how audits are performed. So think about the staffing model that exists today. Okay, if we're not going to have a lot of that manual work that's not highly judgmental performed manually because it's being done automatically through the computer, okay, how do we staff the engagements? How do we teach our younger people? As we came up, many of us in the auditing profession came up doing that sort of work and learning, kind of by doing that less judgmental work and working our way up. How do we create the right environment to create the new seniors, the new managers, and the new partners, and to create the right kind of developmental opportunities? What kind of skills are we going to need off campus, and how's that going to change? I would suggest that we'll need more technology skills and more data analysis skills as we go forward. And there's a whole bunch of other things that I could kill all of our time going through that, but that tees up the issue, gives you a flavor of what the issue is and some of the opportunities, which I think are immense. And I guess maybe one more I'll throw in is standard setting. Clearly the standards are written not for the technology that's to come, and some of it's broad enough where the technology fits in, and that's fine, but undoubtedly the technology will put pressure on standard setting and how the standards need to evolve to get all the benefits from the technology. So Joan, maybe from an audit committee perspective.
Yes, I think just a couple things I wanted to mention. One is, I think, from an audit committee perspective, well, just to pause for a second, I think this is an area where all the firms would agree we're not at nirvana just yet. There's a journey in terms of really understanding how to deal with all the data that's out there and how to be much more efficient, et cetera, and how to do all of the things that Mike just mentioned. So I think this is one where having good transparency with the audit committee in terms of what that journey might look like and a reporting of that to give them the comfort that they are keeping up with the company from a technology perspective, and also efficiently evaluating the data real time, constantly, as opposed to just period of time, number one. The other thing to think about is this an area where potentially an AQI could be helpful? To have some measurements of how you're getting the right people in and what you're doing and so on. I think the last thing, and this is really what I'll put in terms of insight, to think about whether or not, to the extent that the external firm is becoming much more proficient and technologically savvy in this area, to the extent that they can share those best practices and learnings with the internal audit organization of the company and vice versa, so there's sharing of knowledge as we go along.
Thanks very much for that. I think it's triggered a lot of cards. I have one question, Mike, and given data security concerns, are you seeing that companies are allowing auditors to explore their system, the company's systems the way that sounds pretty good, to look for anomalies, to try to pore through the entire ledger and sub-ledgers to search for information in the way you said? I mean, are companies worried about that from a...
Yeah, clearly with everything that's going on with cyber, Marty, there's a heightened awareness of, letting anybody into your systems. But the reality is we do this to some extent already today and have through what we call our data management group. I'm sure every firm has got their own acronym for it. But the tools that will be available, that are coming available now and will be more so in the next couple of years, that will be right in the hands of the people, the core team that's actually executing the audit, that allows for real-time evaluation of what's in the system, as opposed to having to send requests to the technical experts saying, hey, I need a report that does this, I need a report that does that. So the access to the company's information is largely available today, and we can demonstrate that we've got security. We're not into live data. We take a picture of what's there and go through it, and we can demonstrate those appropriate protocols. But there's no question, with everything that's going on with cyber, we're getting more of those questions than we have in the past.
Good, thank you. Chuck Senator.
Apologies in advance as if this is a little bit of a bank shot. But one of the things that struck me here was, and this might be interesting for discussion in the breakouts, has to do with not just being able to sort of use technology to look at data per se, but to sort of get a window into the controls. So I'll use financial services as a little bit of a case study here, which may be analogous in other settings, but a couple of years ago, Knight Capital basically found itself getting sold because of a data problem, because of a process problem involving how its orders were being communicated to the market. It basically created a liability that swallowed the firm. Separately, the SEC and our regulators that deal in the financial services space, and I think this is probably true internationally as well, technology as a process is becoming more of a driver of risk and more of a driver of regulatory liability, where in the past, if a human being did something wrong, we're subject to requirements of reasonable supervision, and it's easy to sort of understand if there's a human being that sort of blows it. But more and more, we're being asked, compliance people are being asked, risk managers being asked to sort of understand and look into the process, not just in terms of software methodology creation, but in terms of internal testing and protocols. And I only can imagine what kind of challenge it must be to an auditor to try to get a window in terms of the quality around those processes. So if this is a separate subject like cyber is separate, I sort of get that, but it strikes me that in light of the magnitude of this risk, in terms of what can happen, what has happened in the space, to the extent that we can sort of maybe talk about and maybe tease out how the auditor can get a window, whether it's through data or access to systems, into these risks to sort of be able to assess them better in terms of figuring out what needs to be pursued in terms of a complete audit.
Great, thanks, Chuck.
Doug Main.
Although it's not new anymore, GRC software, which stands for Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance Software, is on the market and offered by vendors such as SAP, MetricStream, Archer, IBM, and others. And I'll be bold enough to predict that at some point in the future, 3-4 years from now, every company will have GRC software installed just as they do with an ERP system today or utilize CRM. And this software has, I think, a lot of implications from an audit standpoint, but particularly since it's relatively new, it's one that I think should be on the front burner.
Thanks, Doug.
Scott Showalter.
Yeah, Mike, one thing I'd like to maybe add into your hopper around, it sounds like most of your comments along structured data, let's throw unstructured text in there. There's a lot of other information. How does that qualify as audit evidence? How can it be used in the audit? Traditional reliability may not be in play, but does the law of large numbers help you out there? So the whole unstructured text analysis is probably there as well.
That's something that we at CFA Institute in particular are very interested in because people are making investment decisions using unstructured data. But I would also say one thing that that people may want to think about too is as an investor organization, what we think about is as all these technology improvements are made from an audit perspective, it also puts pressure on the relevance of what's disclosed in the financial statement and what's possible. And so that's also another consideration.
Great. Philip Johnson, and John, is your card? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. A lot of what I was going to say was covered by Mike in his opening remarks, but I think I'd just like to comment about the fact that I think that this is a very hot topic, and I do agree that it should be on the front burner for everybody, not just about auditors, because it has implications. Yes, it has implications for auditors. There's massive investment being undertaken, but also it's the knowledge transfer that after that investment that needs with the audit teams. I think that it's got implications for companies because going forward, as this is being used by the auditors, I think a lot of companies may not understand what the auditors are doing. And undoubtedly, third-party software providers are getting into this space already. And so the smaller audit firms may find themselves bringing in proprietary software from third parties, which always has potential risks. And of course, the regulators and standard setters have implications, as Mike mentioned, about the fact that the standards may actually be behind the game. The auditors are doing one thing, and standard setters have standards out there that are out of date. So I think it is important. I think lots of companies in the next few years will be using this type of software in-house. And so I think this is a massive development that is taking place, which everybody should be mindful of and concentrating on. So it's very much a front burner issue as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Philip. And to the point around standard setting, I know that many of the firms, ours included, have been invited by Marty and the PCAOB board members to come in and talk about data auditing. There is a keen interest on Marty's part and the board's part about keeping up and being right there with us and making sure that quality is being best served as these developments become available.
Thanks. We are doing that. I know the IAASB also has a data analytics project on your agenda.
Yeah, Marty, thanks. That's right. We have a working group that's looking at exactly all these same issues. So, like you talked about before, it's a great way to kind of cast the net wide to get a lot of information. And I think that whole question of what needs to be done to the standards is fascinating because I think it's not about making a small tweak or a little fix here. I think it's really looking at the standards and then in view of the fact that as you think about the path forward, I mean, this is just going to increase. So you really need to be thinking about how to make the standards fit for what will happen and what will evolve. And it's very fundamental in terms of what the auditor needs to do from a risk assessment perspective, which I think is some of the conversation that has already been had. But it also gets to describing what are the audit procedures. Because I think some of this really challenges the very fundamental definition of some of the procedures that are in the standards today, and how does the new stuff fit, and how do you evaluate the outputs, and so there's a lot. I mean, it's really interesting.
A lot for all of us on the auditing standard setting side to think about, and we're doing that. Did you have a follow-up, Philip? I see you waved your card.
No, I did have a follow-up, Marty. Just a piece of information that I had a conversation at the English Institute only this week about this, and they do have a work program at the moment, and they've put together a team, multi-stakeholder team, looking at this very aspect. And they are hoping, just for information, they're hoping to deliver the results of that in a paper by the end of this year. So it will be out there, certainly from the work that's being done at the ICAOB.
Thank you. Sri?
Mike, I was surprised that in your slides here, you haven't mentioned big data analytics, which I'm sure is, at the back of everybody's mind here, especially when Scott brought up the idea of structured as well as unstructured data. And I definitely believe that the PCAOB will have to have a separate session, a separate discussion of how big data analytics, continuous monitoring, continuous auditing, all of these advances are going to completely revolutionize the profession. And just as one thought here, I don't see the world very far off when auditors would be able to completely model a company's financial statements and will have their own version of what they expect to see, and all they'll be auditing is the deviations from what the company is reporting and what they already have. This is what is going to be possible with big data modeling and analytics. I mean, the potential is just awesome and immense, and that will completely overturn whatever we've been doing in auditing so far. So
I agree with that.
Yeah, this is very serious. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think we're good. Why don't we go to the next topic?
Okay. Let's move to the auditor's role in non-GAAP measures. As we know, analytical use of non-GAAP measures amongst investors and analysts today has been increasing in terms of its level of importance. These measures are widespread in terms of the use by management. Measures such as EBITDA, free cash flow, adjusted debt are becoming commonplace in the conversations that companies are having about their performance. And so these non-GAAP measures are ones where folks are considering whether the level of assurance is comparable to the importance that is placed on these non-GAAP measures. Clearly, they provide greater insight in terms of the analytics of the company. Investors and analysts are able to look more closely at the financial position and the performance of companies. However, these measures are unaudited, and as a result, they are subject to a lesser degree of independent auditor assurance. As part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the SEC adopted new disclosure requirements as it relates to non-GAAP measures, quite notably Regulation G and amendments to Reg SK and SB. And while I won't go through all of the various criteria of those regulations, I think it's important to note that companies are required to ensure that non-GAAP measures are not misleading, they don't have omissions of material facts. The companies are required to present a reconciliation of the differences between those non-GAAP financial measures and the most directly comparable GAAP measure. And quite importantly, companies are required to explain reasons that the non-GAAP financial measure provides useful information to investors in regards to the company's financial performance and its financial condition. And so the reporting and the use and the reliance of non-GAAP measures have certainly increased in importance, yet the auditor's opinion has remained the same in terms of its responsibilities. According to a McKinsey & Company report in November 2013, many companies, including all of the 25 largest U.S.-based non-financial companies, are increasingly reporting some form of non-GAAP earnings. A PwC study of members of the investment community who they spoke with in 2014 indicated 71% of those U.S. investors would like management to be clearer in its descriptions of the items that it has adjusted in order to arrive at the underlying performance of the company, and they would like to understand better why the company chose those specific non-GAAP financial measures as being important to tell their story. Clearly, these are matters that were raised in the SEC's non-GAAP disclosure requirements. Currently, as Marty mentioned earlier, there are auditing standards pertaining to other information, whereby auditors are required to read and consider whether non-GAAP financial measures are materially inconsistent with information that's appearing in the financial statements. However, it does bring to light a major point of consideration, and that is whether there's an opportunity for there to be an elevation of the level of independent audit assurance regarding compliance, and this is specific, regarding compliance with the regulations that relate to non-GAAP measures that the SEC has put forth in its conditions for use of non-GAAP financial measures. A few potential benefits to assess are whether it would enhance comparability, consistency, and accountability in financial reporting. Could it potentially provide greater investor confidence in financial reporting? Could it increase the relevance of the auditor's work? As we know, we've read over several times in many of the PCAOB reports that the PCAOB aims to increase the communicative value and the relevance of the auditor's work. Joan, would you like to add to that at all?
I think you've covered that very well. Just a couple things to add. Was just mentioned that the reason these non-GAAP measures are out there is because it's believed to be more critical than some of the GAAP measures and very helpful for investors. So questions to be thinking about are, if it were a GAAP measure, you would have SOX controls and it would be tested. So the question is, if it's as important or more important than a GAAP measure, should there be controls that are tested around it, number one. Number two, should there be a assurance that there's consistency in the way it's measured and it's applied consistently year over year and transparent to the reader in terms of how it is measured? And should there be any difference between a quantitative or a qualitative non-GAAP measure, and whether you should apply a different standard to that? And because, as I said, although you do have to reconcile GAAP to non-GAAP, not all non-GAAP measures can be reconciled because there is no analog, so to speak, within a GAAP perspective. And that would be all I would have to add. If there's any other issues to think about.
Thanks, Joan. Well, I'd like to open it to the floor for any points related to this topic.
Ken Golden.
Yeah, I find this one really quite relevant. To me, it says a lot about the state of financial standards right now. And I'm just giving a little discussion here. I remember back around 2009, if I get my timing right, the SEC came out with a speech, and they recommended actually showing more non-GAAP numbers in your filings as long as you reconciled it. I was at another company. We actually did it for our IPO. Got a lot of pushback from my legal folks and from the outside legal folks, and I said I'm still going to do it. We did it. The SEC actually applauded us for doing it. because what they wanted to see, at least in terms of discussions I have had, is consistency between what you say to the investing community on your earnings and your earnings scripts that cover that, and what you say in your filings, as long as obviously you start with your GAAP numbers first. And I think, it is more and more you get back and forth as to critiques of people using non-GAAP numbers, but the reality is that's the way many investors want to see the numbers, and it says something to the fact of are our financial statements that we provide, are they what really financial investors want to see? And so I think this is a clear issue, and what I have heard over and over when I've had discussions with the folks at the SEC, and even in comment letters, whatever, they are constantly reading and listening to your calls. They're making sure you are consistent with what your disclosures are in those calls. And so the fact is we are where we are, and I think we need a better format to both think about the financial statements that we provide in the pronouncements, whatever, and then how we disclose thereon, both in our filings, as well as, in our press releases and so forth. So I think this is a very important item. I think we've given short shift to it because we basically have suggested that non-GAAP numbers don't make a lot of sense and don't use them, and so be it. But the reality is the investing community in many cases wants to see many of these metrics. Could be free cash flow, could be EBITDA, I could go on and on a number of these things, and we don't provide an easy way to show those in our current GAAP numbers.
Thanks, Ken.
Jeremy Perlin.
Yeah, I agree. I think from my perspective at least, this is the most important topic, and it's the biggest problem with financial reporting today. The fact that the auditors aren't participating in the real conversation between companies and investors. I think the most important document to investors at a quarterly release is the PowerPoint deck that big companies give. Not that it's the most informative, but that's where the conversation is had, and it's important because it's full of the most important metrics to both the investors and to the story that management is telling. And so to have some discussion around that from an audit perspective and some oversight. I like the suggestion about, at minimum, making sure or assuring that the definitions of these key metrics haven't changed. Things like that would be very important.
Thanks, Chair. Hey, Doug Main.
Yeah, I'm glad to see you take this on. I raised it at lunch because I think we're really headed toward the Wild West of financial reporting right now. I've seen companies not only EBITDA but adjusted EBITDA and constant currency EBITDA and on and on and on. Guidance being done in non-GAAP measures, and it just feels like I said the Wild West. For those of you who read the New York Times, Gretchen Morgenson tried to take it on this weekend in her article, but I think it's an important issue, and I think there's a lot at stake here. So,
thank you.
Elizabeth Mooney.
Yeah, I agree. It's a super important issue, and it's growing, but I do struggle a little bit with requiring more audit work on it. I mean, when I talk to my colleagues, they talk about how it's got a huge warning label. I mean, it's called non-GAAP. It is outside of the financial statements. And the SEC staff does seem to be focusing on where these reconciliations are not tying to the financial statements. So, I mean, I think it would be really useful to require or for the regulators to put resources towards a proposal of an audited footnote with the key performance indicators that the company and management is using to run the business. Though that would be super valuable disclosure, and I guess if we were to have earnings guidance tied to GAAP, that would be also useful, but that's not going to happen. So it feels a little bit misplaced. I think a good audit committee is already scrutinizing these numbers, hopefully asking tough questions, but it would be really helpful to have the key performance indicators consistently disclosed.
I think you've got a lot of good input for your breakout session. Should we move on to the next topic?
Thank you, Marty. So we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'll try to be a little expeditious on the next two topics. And I need to hesitate a little bit and show my respect to my friend Larry Smith over there, because we are talking about matters that FASB has been involved with, and with that caveat. So recently, in September, the FASB issued two exposure drafts related to the concept of materiality in financial reporting. One affects the definition in the concept statements, which have been around for quite a bit, and pick up on the same type of definition that AS 11 has for the most part, and which is found in the Supreme Court decisions, and basically looking at materiality as a legal concept. Along with that, a companion piece is actually a standard change, an auditing standard change related to footnotes and the disclosures within footnotes, and this has been a part of FASB's ongoing project to improve disclosures, to try to get disclosures more streamlined and more useful for the users of the financial statement. So it's a rather short amendment to the current standards on footnotes, and explains in particular that if immaterial disclosures are not made, that is specifically not an error in the financial statement. So the hope is that will eliminate unnecessary discussions with audit committees about disclosure type errors where that are immaterial. It's possible. I think there are some issues that do come along. Auditors don't particularly like change that much. I think auditors get concerned when accounting standard changes may interface a bit with auditing standards. So we spoke earlier the going concern standard, and whether or not the FASB's going concern standard aligns well with auditing standards related to going concern. So we need to consider that and the implications related to that. I think there is a question about internal control over financial reporting for the process of making a determination as to whether the omitted disclosure decision was made in an effective and proper way by management. I think that's an open question, how that works out. I think there's a potential issue trying to sort it out. The profession's trying to sort it out. What about an accumulation of so-called immaterial disclosures? Is there some sort of threshold where among all the disclosures there's a half a dozen that individually might not be material under the definition that's proposed, but collectively might directionally show a bias for management and so forth? So how is that effectively considered by the auditors and, of course, by management in fairly reporting? We don't want to take judgment out of the auditing process. There is some concern that this takes some judgment away. I'm not sure about that, okay? I'm not sure it's that dramatic, but some have voiced that concern. And certainly some concern, we've seen it in the press, has been raised by the investor and analyst community. I'll leave it up to you to maybe comment on that, either one of you, any concerns you have about the materiality standard or the potential changes to the materiality.
Well, I'll just quickly mention that evaluating materiality, as we know, it requires significant judgment by management, and the tone of the FASB proposal is emphasizing a push for management to exercise greater discretion in determining what is a material disclosure, and therefore it will require that the audit team have the right training and skill sets to address this potentially increased level of discretion that management will apply. And so it becomes quite important, I think, that the audit community pay close attention to these omissions of information as a result of immateriality.
I guess I would just add, having been involved in some of these conversations about the Investor Advisory Committee and also being called by several reporters over the last few weeks about the issue, is that to me it seems like that a greater discussion around the topic so that there's clarity with respect to how the decisions are actually made is important to informing investors about how exactly this is done and how greater discretion, if that is the conclusion, then how do we get there? I don't think that there is complete understanding about how these decisions are taken, and I think it's really challenging for those who haven't sat across the table from a preparer and an auditor during this process to understand all of how that works. So I've encouraged people that I've spoken with at the FASB in particular is to facilitate a conversation between the investment community, auditors, and preparers on how this is actually done, because I just think that there is, would versus could, and it's not immaterial, it's material. How that actually plays out in practice is something that's challenging for people who haven't done it to actually see that, understand it completely.
Questions, comments?
One of the points that was raised about training is a good point. One of the things we've heard over the years here is auditors are pretty experienced at quantitative errors and taking a look at the total of those quantitative errors and adding them up and comparing those to what they set up as tolerable in the statement and what they think is material to net income, and to make that judgment as to what's material or not. It's been pointed out at the SAG a number of times that evaluating disclosure materiality and as someone said, in the aggregate of 2 or 3 disclosures not omitted, not as clear-cut as evaluating a quantitative disclosure. I don't know if you have a perspective on that, Phil or Mike. But
Marty, maybe I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think it's more subjective, right? We love numbers, and you can do things with numbers. You can add them. You can do them as a percentage of things, and certainly omitted disclosures. It's more of a qualitative analysis, although there's a quantitative element too. If the item to which it relates is just not a big deal, then it's probably not a big deal. I guess a couple of takeaways. I was pleased that there's actually a reconciliation or a common definition of materiality. So that aspect of what the FASB did aligned with the PCAOB and what the SEC is doing, that's good. And I do think auditors today do make judgments over omitted disclosures. The difference is how do you think about them and what gets communicated to the audit committee, how do they get characterized to the audit committee. I do think it will change behavior on the part of preparers, okay, in that preparers, it was a stigma to say, well, if I have to call it an error, maybe it's just easier to put the disclosure in. And will this cause, preparers to leave, exercise more judgment, as Joyce said, and that will cause, again, one of the issues Phil brought up, a change in how what are the internal controls over how those decisions are made. And that gets into the auditing issue that I think the auditor, in addition to being comfortable with those decisions, being comfortable with the process as we audit internal control over financial reporting.
Yeah, I would agree with Mike. I mean, I think that it's a highly qualitative process, subjective process. I think that the good auditors attempt really to put themselves in the shoes of the users of those financial statements and trying to assess whether that disclosure or lack thereof would be meaningful to those users. And it takes experience, it takes judgment to do that, and it does not lend itself to that summary of past journal entries. And so I think it'll be an evolving process. Some cynics out there, I'm sure Larry or the board wouldn't want to hear this, but there are a lot of cynics that say it's just too much trouble to take out a disclosure and we're going to keep them all in anyway. But who knows? I mean, how the management will react to the investor community and the people that are talking to them about their financial statements, and whether or not we can actually meet the goal here of getting to improve disclosures that are more useful. Because there's also the problem of too much disclosure hiding the really important stuff and kind of gets lost in the wind.
So you've used a lot of important words like ICFR and judgment and qualitative assessments, and so a lot for the PCAOB to be thinking about in terms of what it is that we need to say to auditors in terms of this accounting change. So good topic to tee up. Brian Croto?
Thanks, Marty. I was actually going to just say some of the same of what you've said relative. So I'm glad we're hearing a lot about controls in this space, given some I think are applying the FASB standards today in this way relative to thinking about whether disclosures are immaterial or not and omitting them, and internal controls are very important in those scenarios. And then, Marty, I know we've had at least some discussion if the FASB were indeed to proceed. I know some have suggested there'd be no discussion with the audit committee about such matters, but I'm not sure that AS16 would actually work that way. I think under paragraph 13 there'd likely be still some discussion relative to the more judgmental decisions being made, but I don't know if you wanted to comment on that before the group goes to discuss.
Yeah, we've had discussions about that the current standards require auditors to present to management their accumulation of misstatements, and a misstatement would be an unrecorded omitted disclosure that was other than clearly trivial. That particular schedule of accumulated misstatements of omitted disclosures is required under Sarbanes-Oxley and under the PCAOB auditing standards to be reported to the audit committee. So if they're not errors, then they wouldn't be accumulated misstatements that wouldn't be reported to the audit committee under that requirement. However, the auditing AS16 does have other provisions in it for the auditor to think about other matters that have to be reported to the audit committee. It's got disclosures around discussing with the audit committee critical accounting estimates and the most important judgments that were made. So there certainly is opportunity for the auditor to continue a dialogue with the audit committee on these matters, even if that schedule is not presented. I think, is that the point, Brian, you were trying to get at there?
And it may be more even than an opportunity, but a requirement, perhaps.
Yeah. Thanks. Tom Self.
The development of the concept of materiality and gap, I think, is a prototype for Sir David Tweedy's earlier observation about how lawyers seem to be running things, and also with respect to Jim Cox's observation about how the courts may be affirming rights that perhaps Congress didn't contemplate. I have in mind the Continental Vending case, and perhaps I'm being presumptuous, but before we adjourn to the breakout groups, I do want to propose that, as the courts did in that case, that our discussion of materiality be put in the context with the meaning of presented fairly in accordance with GAAP. I know we're running short of time, but I hope you will indulge me for a couple of minutes as I explain why I think this is important. Fairly presented... As
long as it's only a couple.
It's only a couple. Fairly presented is a term that has been in the auditor's report for a long time, and I fully expect that the PCAOB will keep the term fair presentation language in the auditor's report as it brings its current project to completion. It would seem to me that fair presentation and materiality are two different benchmarks, and that the PCAOB should take this opportunity to clarify that fair presentation is the higher benchmark and the benchmark against which financial reporting is ultimately judged. So, for me, the SBSB proposals are a timely opportunity for the PCAOB because they highlight the increased emphasis on materiality and the diminished emphasis on fair presentation over time by the profession, which began in reaction to the Continental Vending case in 1970. The court clearly stated that fairly presented and in accordance with GAAP were two separate claims about financial statements. In other words, mere compliance with GAAP was not sufficient to be in compliance with the securities laws. Up until Continental Vending, the accounting profession seemed to have shared the view of the trial and appellate courts. Even though the concept of materiality was enshrined in securities laws 35 years earlier, phrases like fairly presented and form over substance were the terms the professions used to inform investors about what they could expect from financial statements and disclosures. But subsequent to Continental Vending, the profession has worked to make fairly presented in accordance with GAAP one statement instead of two. And as we know, the FASB was founded shortly after that case. In concept statement number 2, the FASB chose to discuss the concept of materiality and essentially ignored the concept of fair presentation. The authoritative standards themselves all bore that black box, stating that the provision of the standards need not be applied to immaterial items, which was abused frequently enough that it compelled the SEC staff to address the issue in Part 2 of SAB 99. Perhaps to be consistent with the auditor's report, the FASB black box should have stated that the standards needn't be applied if, despite doing so, fair presentation is maintained. This is not an irreversible condition. It is a defect that's curable, and I encourage the PCAOB and FASB to collaborate on shifting the emphasis back to fair presentation. Toward this end, I have 2 quick points to make. First, to the PCAOB, that if the term fairly presented is to be in the auditor's report, it must clarify that fair presentation means something apart from technical compliance with GAAP. If it makes this clarification, then the logical extension is that compliance with the materiality standard, however set forth in the FASB authoritative standards or concept statements, cannot be solely determinative of what omissions from the financial statements are tolerable. Essentially, the PCAOB owes the investors to walk the talk with respect to fair presentation. Second, the reason why the FASB and the auditing profession has had such a difficult time in defining materiality is because it may be a useful concept, but I would submit to you, and I hope this is part of the discussion, it's not operational as an accounting concept. I'm going to leave the rest of my remarks for the breakout group, but I hope you get the point of what I hope is accomplished in the breakout groups.
Thanks, Tom, for those comments. Jim Cox.
Just a footnote in support of what Tom was saying, that fairly presents is baked in by Sarbanes-Oxley into the certification process that's expressly required of CEOs and CFOs. So that expression's out there, and it's very hard to run away from it, I think, in anything that would be done by any self-regulatory organization. So.
Thank you. More to follow. So the last topic is the upcoming revenue recognition transition, and I personally think this is the most important matter that the supply chain faces with respect to financial reporting. So 606 is going to be a significant change virtually for all issuers at varying levels. And it's really upon us. Although the FASB did provide a 1-year extension about 7 or 8 months ago because of concerns about the pace of change and the pace and the status of adoption, we're coming in at the end of this year, and for entities that are going to adopt a full retrospective transition, they're going to need numbers from 2016, which starts January 1st, obviously. Issuers need to prepare accordingly for that. Recent speeches by the SEC as far as expectations for SAB 74 disclosures and so forth make this fairly acute. The ASU is still in a bit of flux with FASB considering some proposed amendments. In my view, that's maybe a little bit of a smokescreen. I don't think any of those proposed amendments are really going to drift dramatically from the 5 elements and the considerations that companies need to have. And unfortunately, the guidance that's forthcoming from Financial Reporting Executive Committee, and I happen to be on that, I think is at least 12 months away. It has been a very, very slow process to get the industry groups to surface issues and so forth. It's slowing. And sadly, most issuers are behind. I've got a recent survey from PwC that talks about a really astounding percentage of issuers that have not addressed it at all, and that's a problem, and that's going to be a continuing problem. So the potential implications are broad. You know, what does it do for ICFR, the retrospective measurement issues, ongoing auditing of new concepts, variable consideration, performance obligation, timing of recognition, capitalized cost, et cetera. I mean, it's very, very daunting. And how the profession reacts to that, and importantly, how PCAOB reacts to that, I think is important. You know, there's a bullet there, consideration of specific guidance for auditors, and I mean, I don't think we're talking about standard setting here, but a year or so ago, maybe a half year ago, the staff put out a practice alert number 12 on auditing revenue recognition, which I think was very, very helpful for the profession. I actually think it's probably time for the staff to take a preemptive approach here and consider these implications and maybe tune up, so to speak, alert number 12 for considerations that may or may not change related to ASU 606. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, and Lillian here to my left is on the case, and has been attending all the TRG meetings along with Jay Hansen and myself to stay on top of this issue in terms of the need for the PCAOB to put out some guidance to have some consistency among auditors. Interested in both, maybe Phil, your view, and then Mike's, in terms of the level to which you're getting guidance out to all of your people and training in this regard, and the state of training in a large firm and a medium-sized firm. Mike or Phil, who wants to go first?
Let me give you the bad first. So.
You think mine's going to be good?
Well, honestly, we're behind as far as training. We have done a lot of awareness raising with respect to the standards. It's difficult for the smaller firms, frankly, to provide in-depth training without the guidance that's forthcoming, because we're organized, as many firms are, really on industry lines. And it's just very hard to, on a generic basis, provide the guidance that's going to be relevant for the industry. We have talked about it. We've got a task force formed with our industries and technical representatives from the industries, but in many ways they're in the dark because there hasn't been anything coming out of the profession as of yet. So we have a large healthcare practice. We don't have. And I think that's going to be an industry that's going to be impacted by this quite a lot. And the expert panels haven't come up with anything yet. So we're slow. We're dragging, and we're going to have to scramble once we get something going. So.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, Marty, from the larger firm perspective, we're actually, I think we're in pretty good shape. I mean, not to underestimate the standard, because you learn things as you go through the implementation that will inevitably cause you to have to continue to supplement and adjust your training. But as Phil said, a big part of this has to be done by sector and industry, because they're going to be affected very differently, and making sure you're not putting your practice through a one-size-fits-all. Some parts of the practice are going to need really deep, tough training, and some parts of the practice probably more high level, and making sure you get the appropriate consulting support throughout the organization, both on an accounting standpoint and an auditing standpoint. So I think we feel pretty good about it, but we don't want to underestimate the task.
I would also just add, from an investor perspective, it's hard to get people's attention on this issue. While you would think it's revenue, so it's super important, until you can really talk about it in an industry way, it's hard, and you can broad strokes give them some idea of what the impact might be. It's hard to get people to pay a significant attention to the issue. And it's hard in the, until the SAB 74, this is my belief, until you start to see some of the SAB 74 disclosures and you see some conversation, I'm certain those questions will come because it's revenue, and I think some of recent accounting issues associated with revenue have highlighted in those who follow those issues, what will that be under the new standard? Will those problems still exist, or will those judgments be even squishier? I just think it's hard for them people to get their arms around it quite yet.
Phil, for the benefit of some others, maybe you could talk about, just for a moment, the guidance you referred to and who's working on it and who's developing it. And you said it's 12 months or so away.
Yeah, sure. So the AICPA's Financial Reporting Executive Committee is the chief body that comments on accounting standard setting. They set up, right after the standard was issued, probably was organized beforehand, there are 16 industry-based task forces that have been created. Obviously all volunteer staff, aerospace and defense, real estate, healthcare, banking, it's a long list. Those task forces have been operating for a good year and a half, and they're tasked with surfacing the issues, preparing white papers, how they interpret it for their particular industry, Those go to a group just below the FINREC itself, with Mark Crowley's on it, who's a member of the Transition Resource Group, and they're there to filter those things and say, okay, this is a real issue, we should take it up to FINREC or throw it back to the resource groups. And then finally, the last step, well, not quite the last step, it goes to the FINREC for approval as presented. So there'll be changes in the chapters and so forth. The goal will be a revenue recognition guide. They'll have an overarching section about the standard, the 5 elements, the considerations with that, and then individual chapters for each of those industry groups. My understanding, there's been 160 issues addressed so far by those task force. FINREC has seen about 30 of them. Okay, so there's a lot coming through still. We just recently, first time, I think it was a week or two ago, Aerospace and Defense, we published 6 issues for informal comment by the industry. Aerospace and Defense has done a really good job on it, and to your point, I mean, when you start thinking about this and the complexities in a particular industry, it's quite interesting. So we've seen stuff from broker-dealers, the investment companies. Healthcare is playing around with a draft that hasn't come to FINREC yet. We will get some comment back from FASB before the book is published, and from the SEC before the book is published. But at the pace that we're going, I think it's a year away. I really do. I don't think that they've started drafting the book itself yet. So there's a lot of work to do.
All right, thanks a lot for explaining that to all. Some questions and comments, and we'll just move the session back. I think we'll still be able to start the breakout sessions at about 4 o'clock. So I think we'll be all right.
Yeah, thanks. Just following on your comments, the investors and analysts I talked to just really are pretty surprised this continues to move forward, and it would be really helpful to have communication about how the audit is, the audit standards provide some reliable assurance around this. I mean, this is a big ticket item, and there are some big numbers that are being talked about as pulling forward revenues, and a lot of confusion how it is going to be audited with reliability. So I think there's going to be need to be a lot of communication around that, and if we're not ready, we're not ready. So to implement.
Bill Platt.
Thanks, Marty. I just wanted to bring up a couple of items to maybe keep on the radar screen, or at least talk about. The first is the new revenue standard in accounting will require a lot more estimates to be made. And as you mentioned, you're working on a project related to auditing estimates. We could find ourselves in a position where really the auditing standard and the accounting standard, the new auditing standard and new accounting standard, are coming really into being effective at the same time. I would encourage you, as you develop the auditing standard, to be over-transparent of where you're heading, so that entities, as they design their systems, can generate the right kind of information that auditors are going to need to audit estimates, per se. And so that's just a word of encouragement. I know you always seek to be transparent, but I'd encourage you in that standard, particularly with revenue out there, to be over communicative of the direction you're taking and what you're considering. The second piece, and I don't know if this is really more of an issue for the SEC or the PCAOB, but I do think that with widespread retrospective application, in a world where we have more change of auditors than we've had in the past, I think the issue of how do you audit the retrospective adjustment to those prior periods is worthy of thinking about. And are we going to have really duplicative auditing where predecessor auditors come in and audit adjustments to prior periods, or other things? So it's just an item I think we should put on the radar screen and think about and hopefully to avoid a crisis instead of just trying to deal with it when it happens.
Thanks, Phil and Sri and Marty.
I just want to point out that the 2010 COSO fraud study in their sample found that in 60% of the cases that they studied, revenue recognition schemes were the source of fraudulent financial reporting. So because of this underlying sort of source of fraud risk, this is a really important topic. And that's why I also agree with what Bill Platt just said. The accounting standards and the auditing standards in this area must move in tandem so that, we have complete control over, what's happening.
Any further comments from the panel? Are you ready to roll?
Marty, I think we're in good shape. We're ready for the breakouts. We look forward to a good substantive hour and a half of breakouts.
Yeah, so thank you for introducing such very important topics, and every one of them got a lot of attention from the SAG members, so the panel did a great job in identifying the hot emerging issues, and certainly from the SAG members, thank you all for the input you gave for these discussions. I think we're okay time-wise. Let's try to get to the breakout rooms that you're assigned to by 4 o'clock, and discussion scheduled to end by 5:15. This evening's dinner, I think you have enough time. If it did run over by a few minutes, I think we're all right. But maybe, Jessica, you could give a couple of details on where we're going?
Right, so dinner is at the Churchill Hotel, which is across the street. The reception starts at 6:15 and the dinner starts at 7.
Okay, so see you in the breakouts at 4 o'clock. Thank you.